Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the echoing stone hallways of a medieval fortress. Flickering torches line the walls and you can practically hear the faint howl of wind creeping through gaps in the massive wooden doors. It's the type of place that seems romantic when you're visiting as a tourist, but if you actually had to live here, especially during a winter evening, you'd likely have second thoughts. Before the first hour was up, the truth is castles were absolutely freezing. And if you had to spend the night inside one without central heating, insulated windows, or even a decent mattress by today's standards, you'd quickly discover that your greatest enemy wasn't opposing knights, it was the bitter cold. You probably won't make it through this, at least not without some clever tricks. So before you settle in, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. And if you're listening right now, drop your location and current time in the comments. I love seeing where around the world people are tuning in from. Turn down the lights, let your breathing slow and picture yourself getting ready for bed in a medieval stronghold. You trudge across the stone floor of a great chamber, boots scraping against surfaces worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The cold nips at your skin even though you're fully clothed. The stone walls don't just resist heat, they devour it completely. Historians frequently describe castles as wonders of defence, but seldom as wonders of comfort. And here's the harsh reality. Those same massive walls that could withstand a battering ram also imprisoned cold air like a giant icebox. Once the sun went down, the interior temperature dropped almost as fast as the outside. You'd notice your breath creating clouds before your face. The air inside feels thick, moist, and uninviting. Castles were built to keep enemies out, not to keep the chill at bay. The designers thought about moats, drawbridges, arrow slots, but insulation really wasn't in their plans. An interesting fact worth noting is that many castles in Northern Europe were strategically positioned on windswept hilltops. From a military standpoint, that was genius. You could spot invaders approaching and the slopes provided you with a defensive edge. But, from the perspective of someone trying to get some rest, it was a nightmare. Wind battered every surface and forced icy drafts through cracks in shutters and beneath doors. You couldn't ask for a worse sleeping environment. If you hoped, you might think the fireplaces would rescue you, but nope. Even a blazing fire in the Great Hall barely heated the immediate area around it. And the farther you moved from the flames, the colder it got. By the time you shuffled toward your bedroom, the temperature could feel more like a basement than a living space. Now, here's an interesting detail. In some records from the late medieval era, travellers wrote about the shock of frost forming inside the bedrooms of castles. Picture waking up with icicles dangling from your bed curtains or finding the wash basin frozen solid. Writers treated this as almost routine, not worth more than a brief mention. If your room didn't develop a thin layer of frost on the walls in January, it meant you were among the lucky few. And yet, despite this, people survived. Somehow they figured out methods to keep their bodies from turning into popsicles. Part of that survival instinct involved routine. As evening fell, entire households followed patterns designed to capture whatever heat they could. The castle might be enormous, but the focus was always on reducing the living space at night. Fires were banked, beds were positioned with curtains, clothes were layered until movement was a secondary concern, and everyone hoped the draft wouldn't be too harsh. You picture yourself entering a medieval bedroom. The bed itself is an impressive piece of woodwork raised high above the floor. That wasn't for appearance, it was a tactic to escape the coldest layer of air, which always settles. Even so, the stone radiates chill upward and your body feels it the instant you climb under the covers. Historians still debate whether castles truly became more comfortable as centuries passed, or whether the myths of cozy noble life were exaggerated by later storytellers. Some suggest that tapestries and thick hangings genuinely transformed rooms into warmer spaces, while others insist that the cold always prevailed, no matter how much fabric you draped on the walls. The truth probably falls somewhere in between. Things improved somewhat, but never to the level of real comfort. You lie back in this imagined bed, the wooden frame creaking as straw-stuffed bedding rustles beneath you. Outside, the wind howls against the battlements. The only light comes from a small oil lamp flickering near the bedside, and even that seems like it struggles to stay alive. Your toes already start to ache with the sharp cold, even though you're still wrapped in your daytime clothes. And then the sounds of a castle night drift in, the distant echo of boots on stone as a guard changes watch, the creak of rafters under frost, a dog barking faintly in the courtyard, its voice muffled by the thickness of the walls. You might even hear the drip of water freezing somewhere close by. None of it helps you feel warmer. Instead, it reminds you that the world outside is unforgiving. It's easy to imagine the nobility tucked in perfect comfort while peasants froze in their huts. But here's the amusing thing. Sometimes the peasants had it better. Their homes, built of wood and clay, might trap heat from the hearth more effectively than the vast, cavernous rooms of a lord's keep. A single fire in a small cottage could keep an entire family reasonably warm. Meanwhile, you, a noble in a castle, could shiver in a stone box so large that even 5 roaring fireplaces wouldn't make a difference. That irony wasn't lost on people of the time. A few surviving letters from clerics and noble visitors remark on the difficulty of getting restful sleep in castles during the winter. They described the beds as magnificent, but the nights as harsh. Some even advised travellers to pack extra cloaks, not for appearance, but for survival. As you continue picturing yourself lying there, you begin to appreciate the cleverness it must have taken just to get through the night. You didn't just crawl under a blanket and hope for the best. You layered fabrics, piled on furs, pulled curtains tight, and sometimes even shared your bed with companions, human or otherwise. Every step was about creating mini-climates, little zones of warmth in an environment designed by nature and architecture to be relentlessly cold. The experience changes how you think about medieval life. These people weren't just warriors and lords, monks and maidens. They were survivalists. Every bedtime was a challenge, every winter a trial. And sleep, which we now consider an effortless luxury, had to be engineered carefully with rituals passed down across generations. Imagine how grateful you'd feel for every flicker of warmth, the sudden comfort of a dog pressed against your feet, the thrill of hot stones placed near your bedding, the tiny victory of keeping frost off your beard through the night. These moments would stick with you far more vividly than any feast or hunt. Survival was memorable. So tonight, as you lie in your modern bed with your central heating humming softly, you can spare a thought for those who once lay shivering in stone rooms. Their nights were long, their mornings bitter, and yet they endured. They found a way to sleep in places that should have been uninhabitable. That cleverness is what we'll continue to explore, layer by layer, trick by trick, as this story carries you deeper into the medieval night. You step into the great hall, now the beating heart of any medieval castle. If the bedroom was a tomb of stone and draughts, this place is at least alive with flickers of warmth. Long wooden tables stretch across the floor, their surfaces polished by countless elbows and mugs. The air smells of roasted meat, spilled ale, damp wool and smoke that never fully leaves the rafters. The fire in the central hearth roars brightly, a defiant square of orange heat against the creeping winter darkness. This is where the castle felt most alive. After sunset, people gathered here not only for food, but also to absorb as much warmth as possible before retreating to their icy rooms. Servants dart back and forth, carrying platters of bread, jugs of ale, and great bowls of steaming stew. Dogs scavenge underfoot, tails wagging, hoping for scraps. The hall is loud, almost rowdy, with laughter, song, and the clattering of knives against plates. For a little while, you forget that outside the wind howls across the battlements and frost is forming on the windows. Here's the deal. The Great Hall was the only space in most castles where heating was even remotely successful. A huge open hearth dominated the centre or end of the room, and the fire was fed almost constantly in winter. Logs. Sometimes entire tree trunks were hauled in to keep it going. If you had status, you claimed a seat near it, basking in that golden glow while servants or less fortunate souls shivered along the edges. But here's the catch. Even in this grand room, the heat only travelled so far. The farther you sat from the flames, the colder the air became, until it felt as though the walls themselves breathed out frost. Heat rose upward, trapped in the smoke-stained rafters, while those on the floor wrapped themselves in cloaks and huddled together. In truth, only a lucky few were ever warm, and everyone else pretended to be. One interesting detail that writers mention is that feasts sometimes doubled as strategic heating sessions. Nobles scheduled their largest gatherings during the bitter months, knowing that the body heat of hundreds of guests combined with the fire would turn the Great Hall into something approaching cosy. In some accounts, it's even said that servants were told to stand closer together simply to generate extra warmth. You could say that feasting was as much about survival as it was about celebrating. But the glow of the hall didn't last. When the feast wound down, the musicians packed away their instruments and the guests staggered off to their beds. The fire was eventually allowed to burn low. Embers glowed red, a last stand against the cold, and shadows grew long on the stone walls. That heat you clung to during the evening vanished quickly. Within an hour or two, the Great Hall itself would fall back into frigid silence. Picture yourself now. You're lingering by the fire, unwilling to leave, stretching your hands to soak up every last spark of warmth. Your cheeks glow hot, but the back of your body already feels the cold creeping in, reminding you of what waits upstairs. The smoke stings your eyes and clings to your hair, but you still dread the moment when you have to climb the spiral staircase to your room. Historians still debate whether some castles developed more sophisticated heating systems for their great halls. A few argue that vents and flues allowed the warmth to circulate, especially in later centuries. Others suggest this is wishful thinking, pointing out that medieval building technology simply didn't prioritize comfort. The consensus leans toward the harsher truth. The Great Hall was warm only in the immediate vicinity of the fire and nowhere else. Even the acoustics reminded you that this wasn't a cosy lodge, but a cavernous chamber of power. Every laugh echoed, every footstep amplified until the soundscape itself seemed too large, too cold. And when the hall emptied, the silence became oppressive, like sitting in the belly of a sleeping giant. One of the most telling images is the transition itself, the walk from the Great Hall to your bedroom. Picture leaving the golden firelight, stepping into a narrow passage lit by a single torch. The draft hits you instantly, a knife of cold air rushing through arrow slits and unsealed doorways. Your breath fogs again. The warmth you just carried in your bones drains away, as though the castle itself is feeding on it. That shift from one room of temporary comfort to the endless chill beyond defined medieval nights. Sometimes nobles lingered so long in the Great Hall that they practically slept there. A high-backed bench pulled close to the hearth could serve as a makeshift bed, and servants or guards often collapsed near the embers rather than face their rooms. To sleep near the fire was to risk sparks, smoke, and restless noise. But compared to the icy stone above, it was still tempting. Another curious note from the records. Travellers often complained more about the journey from the Great Hall to the sleeping quarters than the sleep itself. That brief exposure, moving from warmth into cold, was described as a shock to the body. People spoke of shivers lasting all night because of that walk. It's as if the castle itself punished you for daring to think you might be comfortable. The fading glow of the hall was psychological too. You knew that once you left it behind, the night would be long and merciless. The Great Hall was not just a room, it was a ritual, a gathering of warmth before surrendering to the cold. Every torch put out, every cup drained, was another step toward a shivering ordeal in bed. Even in the flicker of candlelight, you sense how temporary comfort really was. The fire that once roared now whispers faintly, sparks popping and dying. A servant pokes at it half-heartedly, then gives up, leaving the embers to fade. The sound of laughter and feasting is gone, replaced by the quiet groans of the castle, settling into the night. And so you turn reluctantly to climb that staircase, cloak wrapped tightly around you, the memory of warmth fading with each step. The glow of the great hall lingers in your mind like a dream you wish could last. But already, your toes numb, your fingers sting, and you realise the rest of the night will be a fight for heat. That fleeting glow is what kept people sane, the ritual of gathering, feasting and basking in firelight before the cold reclaimed its territory. Without the great hall, the castle would have been unbearable. With it, people at least had a chance to remember what warmth felt like, if only for a few hours. You climb higher into the keep now, away from the fading glow of the great hall, and the air changes immediately. The warmth of the fire is gone, replaced by a damp cold that clings to your bones. The walls are thick, thicker than anything you've seen in modern houses, sometimes 12 feet of stone separating you from the outside world. At first, that sounds like protection, but here's the irony. Those very walls that stopped arrows and siege engines also trapped the chill inside. If you've ever stepped into a basement in winter, you know the sensation. The stone holds the temperature like a memory, radiating cold even when the outside air warms briefly. Medieval builders understood strength and permanence, but not comfort. And so the walls became paradoxical, fortresses against men, but not against the weather. One fact historians agree on is that castles rarely warmed beyond a narrow radius around the hearth where a fire blazed. Smoke curled upward, but step just 10 feet away and you were already in an icebox again. Written accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries describe noble families sitting directly in front of the flames, cloaks pulled over their heads, while behind them servants stamped their feet to keep circulation going. The fire created a bubble of tolerable heat, but the stone around it refused to yield. Now, a curious note from travellers' journals. Some complained that the walls themselves sweated. Moisture condensed on the cold stone and ran down in streaks, making rooms damp and unpleasant. Picture lying in bed and hearing tiny drips hitting the floor beside you all night long. Not exactly the lullaby you wanted. In some seasons, moss even grew on the interior surfaces. So yes, you lived inside a castle, but at times it resembled more of a cave. Modern scholars still wrestle with the question of whether tapestries and hangings really made much difference. We picture grand walls lined with richly woven cloth. But did those thick fabrics truly insulate the room? Or did they merely decorate? Some researchers argue they cut drafts noticeably, creating pockets of warmth behind the drapery. Others think this was exaggerated in later romanticised depictions, pointing out that even the richest cloth couldn't compete with freezing air filtering through unglazed windows and door cracks. The debate lingers unresolved, but it tells you one thing clearly. People were desperate enough to try almost anything. So picture it now. You enter a bedroom in late January. The fire in the hearth is small, perhaps already guttering. The walls rise like cliffs around you, their surface slick with condensation. Even wrapped in layers of wool, you shiver. The bed stands proud in the centre, heavy curtains drawn around it. Behind those curtains, the air might be a few degrees warmer, a little cocoon carved out of the cold. But outside them, the room feels like a stone tomb. The psychological effect was just as severe. People wrote about dreading the cold more than hunger or even illness. At least hunger and illness passed, eventually. The cold was relentless, every single night of the winter season. When you lived in a castle, you couldn't escape it. That sense of imprisonment in your own home left its mark. You imagine lying there, pulling the coverlet tight, listening to the hiss of wind sneaking through arrow slits. Your ears burn with cold, your fingers stiffen. Even your dreams, when they come, are haunted by images of ice and fire. The stone walls surround you, not like a protective shield, but like a refrigerator that never switches off. And here's where your perspective shifts. Castles weren't glamorous in daily life. They were survival machines, yes, but they made you pay a price for that protection. Comfort was sacrificed for security, and every winter's night reminded you that stone might keep you safe from arrows, but it would never keep you warm. The more you think about it, the clearer it becomes. Sleeping in a medieval castle was less about resting peacefully and more about staging a small war against the environment. The enemy was invisible but merciless, and the battlefield was always the same: your room, your bed, your body. You shuffle across the room floor, and instead of carpets or polished wood, your boots crunch against something far humbler: rushes strewn across the stone. These weren't just decoration, they were a practical attempt to soften the cold underfoot, soak up spills, and most importantly, act as a crude form of insulation. Documents from the later Middle Ages describe how households renewed the rushes a few times each year, layering them thick in noble halls and rooms. When freshly laid, they smelled faintly of the outdoors, grassy, earthy, almost pleasant. For a little while, you might feel as though a part of summer had been carried inside. The plants added padding, muffled footsteps, and helped hold in what little warmth could be trapped near the ground. But the charm didn't last. Over time, the rushes grew foul. Food scraps, spilled ale and stray bones from the feast lodged themselves within. Mice and insects treated the floor as their playground. If you're picturing a cosy natural carpet, think again. By the end of winter, the rushes could be so filthy that one French moralist complained it was like sleeping in a garbage heap. What strikes you as fascinating is how these rushes worked double duty. Yes, they trapped a thin layer of warmth, but they also absorbed moisture from the damp stone. In a castle where condensation dripped constantly from the walls, this mattered. Otherwise, every step would have been across slick stone and puddles of freezing water. A peculiar aside appears in some English household accounts. Herbs, such as lavender, rosemary, or meadowsweet, were sometimes sprinkled among the rushes. The idea was partly practical. Strong-smelling plants disguised odours from rotting scraps. But it also provided a whiff of comfort in rooms otherwise thick with smoke and damp. Picture settling into bed and catching a faint note of lavender beneath the overwhelming scent of wet wool and wood smoke. It wouldn't make you warmer, but it might make the night a little more bearable. There's an ongoing debate among architectural historians about just how effective these rushes really were. Some argue they genuinely provided warmth by creating an insulating mat between human feet and icy stone. Others dismiss them as largely symbolic gestures of order and cleanliness, pointing out that most of the heat loss came from walls and ceilings anyway. The evidence is patchy, and so the question remains: were the rushes a true medieval technology of warmth, or simply a messy habit disguised as tradition? You picture yourself now lying in bed while a servant finishes scattering new rushes across the room. They crunch softly underfoot, releasing faint aromas as they're trampled down. For a fleeting moment, the room feels cleaner, almost civilized. But you know that by morning, the rushes will already have absorbed the dampness, and the cycle of decay will begin again. Think of the sensory overload of such a bedroom. Beneath your sheets, you might feel the comfort of wool or fur, but rising around you is the musty smell of old rushes, the sharp tang of herbs, and the omnipresent smoke clinging to your clothes. The floor rustles as mice scurry in search of crumbs. Every detail reminds you that survival, not luxury, defined your sleep. Yet there's a kind of cleverness in it too. These people used the simplest materials, plants gathered from riverbanks and fields, and turned them into tools for enduring the long winter. They didn't think in terms of carpets or insulation. They thought in terms of whatever could keep the chill a fraction further away. So as you rest your head in this imagined room, you realize that even the floor beneath you was part of the nightly battle against the cold. Stone was the enemy, rushes were a fragile shield, and every morning began with the question, how long until these two betrayed you with dampness and decay? You sit on the edge of the bed now, running your fingers across the layers of cloth piled high. If there was one medieval survival secret against the night chill, it was fabric. Wool, linen and fur became the weapons of choice, wrapped and layered until you resembled a cocoon rather than a sleeper. Records from household inventories make it clear just how central textiles were to medieval life. Linen sheets were considered the baseline, smooth and cool against the skin, though far less insulating than what came on top. Over that came thick woolen blankets, heavy enough that some people compared them to the weight of a hound, and if you had the wealth, you added fur coverlets, fox, sable, or even bear. Nobles invested fortunes into such bedding, not only for show, but because without it, winter nights could be deadly. But there's an amusing observation buried in the sources. Servants sometimes joked that their masters couldn't move once they were tucked in. So many layers pinned them down that turning over required a monumental effort. Picture being swaddled in 5 or 6 heavy blankets so tightly tucked that you either lay still or risked pulling the covers off and freezing. Warmth came at the cost of mobility, a trade-off most were willing to make. Fur deserves special attention. Beyond luxury, it was genuinely practical. Arctic fox pelts, marten skins and sheepskin all provided dense warmth. One writer describes a noblewoman in Burgundy who refused to travel without her ermine-lined bed covers, even in summer, because she feared catching chills at night. To us, it sounds absurd, but in an age where drafts sliced through every room, paranoia about cold was entirely rational. A strange custom pops up in certain households. Some people believed sleeping under too much linen was unhealthy, because linen was thought to draw out the body's heat. To balance this, they deliberately layered wool or fur above and below, creating what we might call a textile sandwich. The idea was that linen cooled, wool heated, and fur trapped it all in. Whether the theory works scientifically is doubtful, but it shows how people mixed folklore with practical comfort. Scholars continue to puzzle over the social meaning of these textiles. Was fur really about survival, or was it mostly status signalling? On one hand, inventories prove that wealthy nobles collected enormous numbers of fur coverlets. On the other hand, poor families survived without them, relying on coarse wool instead. Some historians argue that furs were primarily symbols of power and rank, while others maintain they were a crucial necessity. In drafty castles, the truth likely sat somewhere in between. They were both life-saving tools and markers of prestige. Now picture yourself beneath these layers. The wool itches faintly against your skin, rougher than modern textiles. Above that, the fur feels dense and almost suffocating, but at least it keeps the cold at bay. The blankets pressed you into the straw mattress with their sheer weight. You shift, but only slightly. Any bigger movement would invite icy air into the cocoon. Your breath warms the space around your face while the rest of you relies entirely on the barrier of cloth. The silence of the room amplifies every sensation, the rustle of linen, the coarse scratch of wool, the faint musky odour of animal pelts. There's something intimate and primal about it. You are wrapped in the skins and fibres of the natural world, every thread and hair a reminder that survival depends on turning the environment itself into armour. And in that thought lies the essence of medieval sleep. To rest was to build a fortress inside a fortress, not with battlements and moats, but with sheets and furs. Each night you barricaded yourself against the cold with whatever textiles you could gather. Without them, Even the most magnificent castle room would feel like the inside of a crypt. So as you lie there in this imagined cocoon, you begin to understand the nightly ritual. Gather layers, weigh yourself down, and hope they hold until morning. The cold might rattle the shutters, creep through the stones, and swirl around your bed. But inside the fortress of fabric, you stood a fighting chance. The bed itself was more than a piece of furniture. It was a machine designed to create a small, livable climate inside an otherwise hostile room. When you draw back the heavy curtains of a medieval four-poster, you aren't just peeking into someone's private sleeping space. You're stepping into a micro-world built for survival. Detailed inventories from noble households show how important these great beds were. Unlike the simple mats of peasants, these frames rose off the ground, tall as a person. Carved from oak or walnut, the posts stood like pillars, often ornately decorated and stretched upward to support a canopy. That canopy wasn't only decorative, it was practical. By draping curtains down the sides, you trapped your own body heat inside. It turned an icy room into something faintly resembling warmth. Think of it like a medieval tent inside your bedroom. Once the curtains were closed, the difference could be dramatic. The heat from your breath, from your body, from the thick bedding, all collected within. In a drafty room, where the temperature might hover just above freezing, those extra few degrees could mean the difference between a miserable night and something tolerable. There's an often cited record from a French duchess who travelled with her bed dismantled and packed on carts. Why go to that trouble? Because the bed wasn't just furniture, it was life support. To sleep in an unfamiliar castle or abbey without your own canopy and curtains was to risk shivering all night long. A curious detail crops up in some English sources. The curtains themselves were sometimes waxed or lined with oiled cloth to block drafts more effectively. Picture pulling those curtains closed, the fabric heavy, faintly smelling of beeswax or resin. They didn't just block the cold, they also created darkness, muffling sound and light, giving the illusion of privacy in rooms that were rarely truly private. Modern scholars still discuss how effective these beds really were. Did they genuinely warm sleepers, or do later romantic depictions exaggerate their usefulness? Archaeological evidence suggests the curtains were thick and layered, so there's reason to believe they worked. Yet some argue the warmth was psychological as much as physical. The feeling of being enclosed, sheltered, hidden away from the cavernous cold. The debate continues, but what remains certain is that people believed in their importance so strongly that portable beds became a noble necessity. Now picture yourself sliding into one. The bed creaks under your weight. The straw mattress rustles, and then you reach to pull the curtain closed. Instantly, the air feels different. Still cold, yes, but no longer assaulted by drafts from the arrow slits. Your breath fogs less quickly. Your body relaxes into the layered covers, and you sense that you might actually fall asleep. The curtain muffles the faint drip of water from the walls, the distant cough of a servant in the hallway, even the bark of a dog outside. Inside, it smells of fabric and fur, faintly musky but comforting. You hear only the rustle of your blankets when you shift. The room beyond may be vast and inhospitable, but here in your bed you've carved out a pocket of life against the elements. It wasn't foolproof. Some nights the curtains froze stiff where condensation collected. Other nights the smoke from the hearth drifted inside, choking you awake. But for most nobles, the four-poster canopy bed represented the best defence available against the nightly siege of cold. And this is where you realise the cleverness of medieval people wasn't in grand inventions, but in small, clever adaptations. No central heating? Then build a private climate bubble. No insulation? Then hang thick curtains and seal yourself in. Every night was a negotiation with the cold, and the canopy bed was the closest thing to a truce. Picture lying there now, your eyelids heavy, the world beyond the curtain fading into silence. The room is still cold, the castle still draughty, but you've made a space where survival feels possible. You drift towards sleep, not because the night has grown warmer, but because you've managed, through fabric and wood, to outwit it just enough. Beneath all those blankets and curtains, the foundation of your night's rest was still the mattress itself. What lay under you could determine whether you passed the night in some level of comfort, or whether you woke aching, frozen, and grumpy. In the Middle Ages, bedding came in many forms, but two stood out: the feather bed and the straw tick. The feather bed was the luxury choice. Picture sinking into a sack stuffed with goose or duck feathers, soft and pliable, cradling your body with warmth. Inventories from noble estates often list multiple feather beds, carefully stored and moved with the household whenever the lord travelled. A well-stuffed feather mattress could be so thick that one sat nearly a foot above the bed frame, a bouncy cushion in an otherwise unforgiving room. Families prized them, guarded them, and passed them down as treasured possessions. They weren't simply comfortable, they were symbols of status. But here's the thing. Feather beds could also become suffocatingly hot, trapping body heat until sleepers woke drenched in sweat, even in winter. One amusing complaint survives from a 15th century letter where a guest moaned that his host's bed swallowed him like a goose in a pot. Too many feathers meant you sank too deep, and instead of gently cushioned sleep, you spent the night struggling to crawl back to the surface. For most people, though, the reality was a straw tick, a large sack filled with straw, hay or reeds, stuffed until it formed a crude mattress. Common folk relied on them, warriors depended on them, and even grand fortresses packed their lesser rooms with them. They were inexpensive, simple to replenish, and reasonably effective at keeping you above the frozen ground. Yet straw brought its own problems. It compressed rapidly, pierced through fabric, and frequently housed fleas. Families had to pound the mattress regularly, literally striking and agitating the straw sack to restore its loft and chase away bugs. Come dawn, your skin might burn from straw cuts, but at least you'd made it through the darkness. Historical records mention an interesting detail. Many people blended herbs into the straw, not just to freshen the scent, but to repel insects. Lavender, mint or pennyroyal would be scattered in, creating a subtle aroma that concealed the bitter smell of moist hay. Anyone who's rested on a straw-filled mattress understands the odour never truly disappears. It clings, earthy and mouldy, infiltrating clothing and hair. Historians continue debating how prevalent featherbeds actually were. Some claim they were scarce treasures meant only for society's elite. Others reference documents showing middle-class homes possessing at least one featherbed, implying they were more common than previously thought. The disagreement stems from incomplete evidence, but what emerges is that sleeping arrangements mattered enough to be carefully documented. Picture yourself settling onto a straw tick in a breezy chamber. The sack crackles underneath you, irregular bumps digging into your spine. Every movement releases a burst of grassy fragrance mixed with the sharp bite of herbs. You catch the faint scratching of mice somewhere within the floor rushes, wondering if they'll visit you tonight. The coverings above weigh heavily, but the straw below serves as a reminder that comfort in this era was never assured. Now consider the alternative. A feather mattress in an aristocrat's quarters. You sink deeply into the plushness, your frame embraced by down. It seems divine until the heat becomes overwhelming. The feathers shift and you tumble into a depression that cradles you uncomfortably tight. You wrestle with the blankets, seeking cool air, but the drapes trap everything inside. You drift back to sleep regardless, understanding this unease is still infinitely better than straw. The decision between straw and feathers reflected medieval society's hierarchy. To rest on feathers meant belonging to the elite. To rest on straw meant accepting practicality. Both, though, addressed the same problem, keeping the human body alive in frigid, merciless stone rooms. So as you settle into your imagined bed tonight, you understand that medieval sleepers were never helpless. Every mattress, whether modest or magnificent, represented effort, ingenuity, and a small triumph against the cold. You didn't simply fall into bed. You made a calculated choice: surrender to feathers or endure straw, all hoping to survive until sunrise. Even the most expertly constructed bed with its hangings, feather mattresses, and mountains of blankets couldn't always ensure survival alone. What determined the outcome on the harshest nights wasn't furnishings. It was companionship. Sleeping solo in a stone chamber meant your body warmth simply leaked into the walls. Sleeping alongside others meant heat magnified. Bodies functioning like furnaces pressed together in the darkness. Noble households grasped this, though they seldom acknowledged it publicly. Servants frequently slept in adjacent quarters or even on mats at their master's bedside. The setup wasn't only about duty or protection, it was also sensible. More people in a room meant higher temperatures, even if just by a few vital degrees. You might not sense the warmth initially, but around midnight, when ice formed on the inside of the shutters, every additional body mattered. Reports from medieval monasteries show that monks slept in long lines, their beds or straw pallets arranged side by side in drafty dormitories. The logic wasn't purely communal order, it was also survival. In those packed spaces, body heat formed a layer of protection, however thin. The same concept applied in barracks, where soldiers clustered in rows, cloaks drawn tight, trusting that together they'd withstand the chill better than separately. An interesting story emerges from a 14th century English estate. One nobleman's testament specifically commanded that his cherished squire be granted a spot near his lord's chamber fire at night. Experts interpret this not just as a sign of favour, but as acknowledgement that the warmth of companionship held value equal to inheritance. To be asked to share a bed or room wasn't merely intimacy, it was a privilege of warmth. There was naturally another aspect to this custom. Animals, dogs especially, became literal heating devices. The expression three-dog night might come from later folklore, but the concept is grounded in truth. Medieval people frequently allowed hounds into bed, not just for friendship, but because the creatures radiated heat. A pair of large mastiffs curled at your feet could mean the difference between numb extremities and comfort. Travellers even noted that in certain inns, guests slept crowded together with dogs, goats, or even sheep beside them. The odour was powerful, but warmth defeated fragrance. Academic discussion persists over how socially acceptable bed sharing was among aristocrats. Some claim it was standard: lords with trusted allies, ladies with servants, travellers with strangers. Others maintain that among the wealthy such closeness was restricted and carefully monitored, with servants confined to nearby pallets rather than inside the actual bed. What remains certain, however, is that among lower classes, bed sharing was routine. Families crowded together, parents, children, and often elders, creating a maze of limbs under a single pile of covers. Privacy meant nothing when survival was threatened. Imagine now that you rest in such a bed, not alone, but squeezed shoulder to shoulder with others. The initial moments feel strange. Elbows jab, someone sneezes, a blanket shifts. But gradually the warmth accumulates, a shared envelope of body heat. You sense the dog's bulk against your feet, hear the quiet breathing of your companions, and slowly your muscles relax. The fortress may howl with wind, but inside this cluster you almost trust in comfort. Naturally, this came with complications. Fleas and lice transferred easily, and murmurs in the dark carried secrets. But when you measured those annoyances against the threat of trembling through a sleepless night, the decision was obvious. You chose warmth over pride, companionship over isolation. To contemporary minds, the idea of sharing a bed with servants, relatives, or animals might seem uncomfortable, but for the medieval sleeper it was survival wisdom, inherited and embraced as natural logic. In a world of stone and frost, every extra body was a gift. So as you adjust your own blanket tighter tonight, consider those ancient sleepers who confronted the same cold but had fewer defences. Their answer was share whatever warmth you possessed and pray the night would be kind. Picture extinguishing your candle and settling under the covers. It isn't just the blankets or the bed hangings that preserve you tonight. It's also what you're dressed in. Unlike the contemporary habit of changing into pyjamas or even nothing at all, medieval people frequently went to sleep nearly as bundled as they were during the day. Clothing itself became part of the protection system. Household records and surviving garments reveal that the primary nighttime attire was the nightshirt, a long, loose linen garment resembling an oversized tunic. Linen might not seem warm to you, but it was the sensible choice, easier to clean compared to wool, relatively smooth against skin and breathable. Over that, you might add an extra wool tunic or even a cloak, depending on how severe the cold was. To medieval thinking, the more layers the better, but one detail stands out: the nightcap or coif. These were small cloth caps tied beneath the chin or simply pulled snugly over the head. Why such emphasis on covering the skull? Because it was widely understood, quite reasonably, that most body heat escaped through the head. A medieval sleeper without a coif was like a knight without armour, dangerously exposed. Illuminated manuscripts even depict figures tucked into bed with their heads neatly covered, appearing more ready for a journey than for dreams. The nightshirt itself could differ in length. Poor families wore what they owned, often their undertunic repurposed for sleeping. Wealthier nobles ordered nightwear decorated with fine thread or trimmed in fur. Some ladies even owned sleeping hoods that trailed with ribbons, though one suspects those were impractical in reality. Whatever the design, the rule was cover everything possible. A fascinating note from a 15th century medical text suggests that sleepers wrap their feet in linen or wool against the night air. This wasn't mere fashion. It was early understanding that extremities froze first. People bound their toes, ankles, and even hands in strips of cloth before bed, creating improvised socks and mittens. You can almost sense it. Your hands wrapped, your feet enclosed, every inch of skin protected from the relentless cold. But what about discussion? Scholars stay divided over how widely specialised sleep clothing existed, as opposed to simply reusing daytime garments. Some argue that for peasants, there was no such thing as nightwear. People simply collapsed in whatever they wore during the day. Others point to wills and inventories that mention night linens, specifically suggesting that, at least for the middle and upper classes, distinct sleep attire was standard. Both perspectives hold merit, depending on status and location, but all agree that covering up at night was essential. Now picture yourself preparing for bed this way. You remove your heavier outer layers, slip into a long linen shirt and pull a cap snugly over your ears. The air bites at your neck until you draw the blankets up. Every thread of fabric adds a tiny layer of defence, and together they form a cocoon. The bed might be drafty, the room freezing, but at least your body has become a fortress of cloth. The sensory details are sharp. The linen is cool and faintly rough at first, warming as your skin heats it. The wool smells faintly of sheep and lanolin, earthy but comforting. Your cap presses gently around your head, muffling sound and making you feel enclosed. You wiggle into position, wrapped like a package, and wait for sleep to arrive. There was another reason for night clothes beyond warmth: modesty. In a world where bed sharing was common, being partially dressed or naked was unacceptable. Even married couples were often shown in manuscripts wearing caps and long shirts in bed. It wasn't just about surviving the night, it was about propriety. And so, whether you were a lord, a lady, a servant or a soldier, your nightshirt and coif served a social purpose as much as a practical one. Think of the rhythm of such nights, the ritual of dressing not down but up, layering more cloth, tying knots and smoothing wrinkles before extinguishing the light. In our contemporary understanding, nightwear is linked with relaxation. For the medieval sleeper, it was armour against the elements. So as you pull your own blanket tonight, think of those long-ago figures who climbed into bed looking more like travellers than dreamers. Bundled in linen and wool, heads wrapped tightly against the dark, their sleep was not effortless. It was constructed, stitch by stitch, layer by layer, against the endless assault of cold stone. Picture the moment before you slip under the covers. A servant approaches carrying a long-handled pan, its brass surface glowing dimly in the firelight. Inside, hot coals crackle and hiss, filling the chamber with the scent of ash and heated metal. This peculiar object was the medieval warming pan, a device as simple as it was brilliant, because who wanted to crawl into sheets that felt like blocks of ice? The process went like this. The servant slid the pan back and forth between the bedclothes, the coals inside radiating heat through tiny holes. The sheets above billowed with smoke, and the air filled with the subtle tang of burning wood. For a few minutes the bed transformed from a frozen slab into something almost welcoming. Without this step, you might lie shivering for an hour before your own body heat finally softened the chill. Surviving inventories from noble households list warming pans alongside candlesticks and chamber pots. Standard tools of nightly life, they weren't unusual. They were anticipated. By the late Middle Ages, wealthy homes across Europe considered them essential. In winter, a chamber without one was either neglected or occupied by someone low enough in rank not to deserve the luxury. But these pans carried dangers too. Contemporary letters complain of sheets burned black or even ignited when servants left the pan in one spot too long. Imagine sliding into bed only to discover a smoking hole where your linen should be. There are tales, half amusing, half tragic, of noblemen leaping from bed in the middle of the night because sparks from a warming pan had caught the blankets. In a wooden-roofed chamber full of dry rushes, such accidents were serious matters. One particularly strange account from Italy describes sprinkling aromatic herbs directly onto the coals before warming the bed. The smoke left behind was thought to cleanse the air and ward off disease. You can almost smell it now, lavender and rosemary mingling with the sharp tang of embers clinging to the fabric as you finally climbed beneath it. The practice combined practicality with superstition, a nightly battle against both cold and invisible illnesses. Specialists in medieval domestic life continue discussing how widespread warming pans truly were. Some argue they were limited mainly to high-status households, too expensive and dangerous for common folk. Others counter that simpler versions, such as clay pots filled with embers wrapped in cloth, were common among middle-class families. The truth is hard to pin down because such humble items rarely survived. What's clear, however, is that some method of preheating the bed existed across society, even if the form varied. Now imagine yourself observing the process in your chamber. The servant draws the pan steadily across the sheets, steam rising faintly as moisture evaporates. When the pan is removed, the air under the covers is surprisingly warm, almost startling after the bitter cold of the room. You slide inside quickly, trying to capture that heat before it escapes. For a few minutes, the cocoon feels wonderful, as if you've stolen a pocket of summer in the heart of winter. But it doesn't last. The warmth fades rapidly, replaced once more by the relentless chill of the castle walls. The trick was never about keeping you comfortable all night. It was about making the first moments of sleep bearable. Once your body relaxed, once exhaustion overcame the shivering, you were more likely to drift into slumber and let your own heat do the rest. The warming pan was a symbol of compromise. Never enough to solve the cold entirely, but enough to buy you a start. In a way, it was like making a deal with the night. Give me a few minutes of comfort, and I'll endure the rest. As you imagine yourself lying there, drifting off with the faint scent of embers still clinging to your sheets, you realise just how ritualised medieval sleep really was. Every evening involved a choreography of tools, garments and gestures. The warming pan wasn't a luxury for display, it was part of the survival kit, and without it, many nights would have begun in misery. Instead of rest, you shift in your imagined bed, pulling the heavy blankets closer, when suddenly you feel a weight press against your legs. A warm, solid shape curls into the bend of your knees, sighs contentedly, and settles down for the night. It isn't another person, it's a dog, or perhaps two, maybe even three, if you were fortunate. The practice of letting animals share the bed was far from unusual. Dogs, especially, weren't just guardians of property or hunting companions. They were heaters. Their thick coats radiated warmth, and their loyalty meant they would stay near their masters through the long hours of darkness. A castle chamber that felt like an ice cave could become significantly more bearable with a few hounds snuggled up at your feet. Wills and household records from the later Middle Ages occasionally mention small lapdogs gifted to noble women, not only for companionship but for warmth in bed. These comfort dogs, as we might call them now, were pampered creatures, brushed and perfumed, but their most important role was to chase away the chill of winter nights. Larger breeds, meanwhile, stretched out like furry logs across the bottom of the bed, protecting toes from frostbite. There's even a curious reference from Scandinavia describing how travellers in winter inns often requested to sleep in stalls with animals rather than in the unheated guest rooms. Horses, cattle and sheep produce so much heat that sleeping near them was preferable to a lonely bed in stone. Imagine drifting off to the steady breathing of a cow beside you, the air heavy with the smell of hay, but your body warmed by the sheer heat of its bulk. Not glamorous, but effective. Dogs, however, carried a special intimacy. A medieval proverb in French claims that a faithful dog keeps the frost away from his master's heart. It's both literal and poetic. The animal's warmth sustained the body, while its presence soothed the spirit. In lonely, draughty castles, scholars remain divided on how universal this practice was. Some maintain that allowing animals in noble beds was frowned upon in formal households, relegated to private indulgence rather than open custom. Others argue the evidence suggests it was widespread, especially in rural or frontier castles where survival mattered more than etiquette. The debate circles around whether the image of a lady sleeping with a lapdog is romantic exaggeration or practical truth. Now picture the scene vividly. You lie swaddled in your linen nightshirt and wool blankets, the curtains of the bed drawn tight. Outside, the wind screams along the battlements. Your toes ache with cold until suddenly you feel the warmth of a hound pressed against them. Its fur is coarse, its body solid, and though it carries the scent of the hunt and the outdoors, you welcome it without hesitation. Another dog curls at your side, and soon you are cocooned not just in cloth, but in living heat. The chamber may still be icy, but inside the bed, the world is transformed. Of course, this came with inconveniences. Dogs shed hair, tracked in dirt, and sometimes chewed on bones hidden under the covers. Insects travelled with them, spreading to their human companions. And yet the trade-off was worth it. Better fleas than frostbite. Better a dirty blanket than a night without sleep. The sensory mix is unforgettable. The earthy smell of dog fur, the faint smoke clinging to your clothes, the heavy press of blankets, and underneath it all, the steady rhythm of another creature's breathing. It's no wonder people spoke of their animals with affection bordering on reverence. To share warmth was to share survival. The image of the three-dog night, though a phrase coined much later, captures the essence of medieval sleeping habits. 1 dog meant manageable cold. 2 meant serious chill. 3 meant the night was so bitter that even nobles stacked every possible source of heat into the bed. So as you lie there in your own bed tonight, think of how extraordinary it must have felt for people in castles, isolated by stone, assaulted by draughts, surrounded by darkness, to draw strength and comfort from the simple loyalty of an animal curled by their side. In that small exchange of warmth, human and dog kept each other alive through countless winter nights. Pull the curtains back for a moment and step outside the noble chamber in your imagination. Across the courtyard, in the shadowed servants' quarters, another world of sleep unfolds. The contrast between peasant and noble slumber was stark, and yet the outcome survival through bitter nights was the same goal. Who then truly slept warmer? The answer might surprise you. Nobles had grandeur, featherbeds, fur coverlets, warming pans and thick canopies, but grandeur did not always mean comfort. Their bedchambers were enormous, built for display as much as for rest, and all that space made them impossible to heat. Even with roaring fireplaces, the stones absorbed warmth like a sponge. So a lord might lie on heaps of down and fur, yet still breathe air that froze into mist before his eyes. Meanwhile, peasants lived in humbler houses of timber and mud, small enough that a single hearth warmed the entire interior. A thatched roof thick with straw acted as insulation. Families huddled together, often with animals housed at one end of the room, and the combined heat kept the air far more tolerable than in a draughty keep. A visitor to a 14th century English village wrote with mild amazement that though the huts were crude, they held warmth far better than the Lord's Tower, and yet status determined more than comfort. Nobles had access to finer materials, wool of high quality, imported furs, linen that softened with washing. Peasants made do with coarse woolen blankets patched until they thinned, or sheepskins cured roughly in smokehouses. Their bedding smelled strongly of lanolin and hearth smoke, and though it insulated well, it never looked or felt luxurious. One curious note from manorial records shows that peasants sometimes slept directly on benches near the fire, their children curled in their laps. They risked sparks and smoke, but the closeness to the hearth guaranteed warmth. In contrast, the noble's bedchamber, separated from the great hall, often lacked that immediate heat. Comfort was thus unevenly distributed, not always in the way you'd expect. Researchers today still puzzle over the real hierarchy of warmth. Did wealth automatically buy you better sleep? Or did peasants, in their cramped but snug cottages, manage to endure the winter nights more easily? Evidence points both ways. Some scholars argue that nobles' sheer volume of textiles kept them superior. Others insist the smaller communal spaces of the lower classes offered practical warmth that the aristocracy's grandeur could not match. The discussion remains unresolved, highlighting how much sleep itself mirrored social divisions. Imagine now the two scenes side by side in the castle. A nobleman shifts beneath heavy layers, his breath curling white, the vast room echoing with every gust of wind against the shutters. Down in the village, a peasant family squeezes onto a straw mattress before the hearth. Children nestled like kittens, the smell of animals drifting from the stall nearby. One bed is ornate and stiffly formal, the other crowded and earthy. But which body wakes warmer? The question lingers, and perhaps no single answer fits all cases. Still, both noble and peasant shared one truth. They adapted. Survival in the medieval night was not about absolute comfort, but about learning to live with hardship, reshaping homes and habits until rest became possible. Nobles may have flaunted luxury, peasants may have relied on closeness and simplicity, but all slept under the same winter stars, shivering and dreaming their way toward morning. As you drift in your own warm bed tonight, you can sense the irony. Status determined the trappings, but not always the quality of medieval sleep. Sometimes the humblest hut held more genuine warmth than the grandest hall. You might think that once a bed was established in a noble chamber, it never moved. After all, these beds were massive objects, heavy with carved posts and curtains. But in practice, families often shifted where they slept according to the season. Bedrooms were not fixed, timeless sanctuaries. They were flexible spaces, chosen for their relationship to sunlight, fire, and wind. In other words, you chased the sun in winter and fled it in summer. Documents from noble estates reveal this habit plainly. Some castles had winter chambers and summer chambers, not because people wanted a change of scenery, but because the physics of warmth demanded it. In cold months, families moved into rooms with southern exposure, where the weak sun struck through the windows. For a few precious hours each day, the walls there stored a little more heat. The air felt a little less hostile, and waking up wasn't quite so brutal. Come summer, they abandoned those sunlit spaces and retreated into north-facing rooms, darker and cooler. There's a well-documented example in the accounts of Edward IV's household, where entire beds and furnishings were moved seasonally. Servants carried feather beds, linens and tapestries from one chamber to another, creating temporary nests wherever the king chose to rest. It was a logistical ordeal, but for those living in stone palaces, mobility was essential to survive. A curious note survives from a Burgundian courtier who complained in a letter that he lost his chamber to the frost one year. The walls, he said, grew so damp and cold that he refused to sleep there, choosing instead a narrower room facing the rising sun. His phrasing reminds us that in castles, the building itself was an adversary. Rooms were conquered by cold, surrendered and retaken with the seasons. Archaeologists and architectural historians still debate whether every castle truly offered multiple seasonal chambers, or whether this was a luxury of the grandest estates. Some argue that the majority of castles had only a few suitable rooms for sleeping, forcing residents to endure the cold where they were. Others insist that evidence of window placements, fireplaces, and surviving records shows intentional design for seasonal living. The argument remains unresolved, but the image is persuasive. A noble family migrating within its own walls, like birds shifting nests as the weather turned. Now imagine yourself following this routine in autumn. You begin to eye the sunlit side of the keep, knowing that soon the long nights will demand every advantage. Servants dismantle your bed, hauling frame, mattress and hangings piece by piece. The sound of carpenters adjusting posts echoes in the new chamber, while tapestries are hammered into place to block drafts. By the time the first frost comes, you are tucked into a room that at least greets you with pale shafts of morning light. The sensory detail is vivid. You wake to the thin warmth of the sun filtering through shutters, the smell of woolen curtains freshly rehung, and the faint sound of servants sweeping rushes across the floor of your relocated chamber. The shift does not eliminate the cold, it simply manages it, turning unbearable into survivable. Peasants, too, shifted their sleeping spaces seasonally, though less formally. Families might sleep close to the hearth in winter, crowding around the fire in one room, and then retreat to lofts or barns in summer where the air was cooler. In both castles and cottages, sleep was mobile, dictated by the elements rather than interior design. This practice reminds you that medieval life had little of our modern notion of fixed bedrooms. A bedroom wasn't a permanent sacred space. It was a temporary camp within the larger fortress of stone. Beds were moved, chambers rotated, and life adapted in rhythm with the seasons. The castle was alive, reshaped by light and temperature, its inhabitants shifting like nomads within its walls. And so you see another truth of medieval sleep. It was dynamic, not static. The fight against cold demanded movement, planning, and constant adjustment. You did not sleep where you wanted. You slept where the sun, the wind, and the damp permitted. And each year, as the earth turned, you began that cycle again. Stand for a moment by the narrow window of a medieval chamber and feel the draft slip across your skin. Unlike today's homes, with their glass panes and sealed frames, castle windows were vulnerable holes in the wall. They were defences against arrows, but invitations to the wind. Without glass, without double glazing, Without even the notion of insulation, these openings were simply shutters or stretched cloth that kept out little more than rain and birds. Written surveys of medieval households reveal that in many castles, glass was so rare it was reserved for chapels or the lord's private oratory. Ordinary chambers had wooden shutters, thick planks that could be barred from the inside. In summer, they stood open for light and air, but in winter they shut tight, creaking in the wind. Yet wood alone was no shield against the chill. Cold crept through cracks and the room grew damp. A practical solution was to stretch cloth across the opening. Sometimes linen soaked in oil or wax to make it translucent and resistant to rain. By day, this allowed a dim amber glow to enter, soft and hazy, like sunlight through parchment. By night, it dulled the shriek of the wind, but never silenced it. The fabric flapped, the frame rattled, and sleepers learned to live with the constant reminder that their fortress was porous. One intriguing reference comes from a 13th century French household account describing horn windows. Thin slices of animal horn were scraped translucent and set into wooden frames. These provided a crude but sturdier alternative to cloth. They admitted pale light and resisted weather better, though they yellowed quickly and warped. Imagine looking out through such panes. The world blurred as if seen through fogged glass. Yet inside your chamber, the air just a fraction less brutal. Archaeologists and architectural historians debate how common these horn or oiled cloth windows really were. Some argue they were luxuries of the wealthiest castles, while most households relied only on shutters. Others suggest that by the later Middle Ages, they were surprisingly widespread in northern Europe. The evidence is fragmentary, but the very existence of debate reminds us how desperate people were to improvise barriers between themselves and the cold. Now picture yourself at such a window. The shutter is drawn, the cloth tacked across the frame, and still a sharp line of frost forms along the sill. Your breath clouds as you lean near it. Outside, the snow reflects the moon, but inside, you hear the faint rattle of wood and the moan of wind searching for a gap. No matter how carefully you hang your bed curtains, you know the draught will find its way to you. The soundscape is haunting, shutters banging in a distant corridor, fabric snapping faintly like sails, servants muttering as they stuff rags into cracks. Some households even pressed moss or clay into gaps around the frames as makeshift insulation. It was messy, unsightly, and temporary. But when the night dipped below freezing, any measure was better than none. Peasants in cottages faced the same battle. Their houses often had no windows at all, just shutters to close off narrow slits. Some used bladder membranes from animals stretched thin to let in light. The effect was eerie. Rooms glowed faintly, but with distorted shadows, as if the world outside were behind a veil. At night, though, even these coverings hardened with frost, turning translucent sheets into brittle ice. For nobles, the irony was bitter. Their high towers gave them status and defence, but also exposed them to cutting winds. Guests sometimes remarked that the higher they slept, the colder they felt. A peasant, in his low hut, might envy the wealth of a lord, but not the draught whistling through a tower chamber window. And yet, there was beauty too. Imagine lying in bed on a moonlit night, the shutters cracked just enough to let silver light wash across the floor. The cold seeped in, yes, but so did the poetry of shadows, the silhouette of branches against the curtain, the faint glow of snow outside. Medieval sleep was a balance of discomfort and wonder, where the harshest nights also offered moments of fragile peace. So when you draw your own curtains tonight, picture those ancient windows. They were less barriers than reminders that no matter how thick the walls, the night always found its way in. Sleep was never about conquering the cold entirely. It was about learning to live with it, draught after draught, until morning broke. You picture yourself approaching the hearth of a castle bedchamber, expecting salvation in the blaze. Surely a fire in a stone room must mean warmth. But the reality is far less comforting. Medieval fireplaces were enormous, their chimneys yawning wide enough that entire trees could be fed into them. Yet for all their spectacle, they were poor at actually heating the space. The reason was simple physics. The wider the chimney, the more heat escaped directly upward with the smoke. Flames roared, sparks danced, logs collapsed into glowing embers. And yet, step more than a few paces away, and your breath still misted in the air. The fire created a bright oasis of heat in its immediate circle. But beyond that, the castle chamber remained bitterly cold. Household records emphasize how much wood this demanded. A single winter week in a large castle might consume entire wagon loads of timber. Forest management became a constant concern, not just for construction but for fuel. One lord in France complained bitterly in his letters that keeping his great hall warm had emptied the woods faster than any war. Fires devoured resources, yet rarely provided the comfort one imagined. There are amusing accounts too. Guests sometimes joked that noble fireplaces were big enough to roast an ox, but too weak to warm a man. The exaggeration rings true. These hearths provided spectacle, light, and a sense of majesty, but little real relief against the unrelenting chill of stone walls. Some households experimented with placing iron firebacks behind the flames, reflecting heat into the room. Others lined hearths with tiles to store warmth a little longer. But these measures were partial solutions, tinkering against a problem too large to conquer fully. A blazing fire might keep your feet warm if you sat right in front of it, but your back remained icy, and your bed across the room might as well have been outdoors. Scholars still dispute how effective castle fireplaces truly were. Some argue they provided meaningful warmth when combined with hangings and heavy furniture, creating a layered system of heat retention. Others contend they were almost symbolic, more about status and ritual than comfort, since most of the energy vanished up the chimney. The truth likely varied from castle to castle, depending on resources, design, and climate. Now imagine yourself in such a room. The fire crackles loudly, spitting sparks onto the hearthstones. Smoke curls upward, leaving a faint tang in the air. Your face feels flushed, prickling with warmth, but your shoulders remain cold. You shuffle closer, holding out your hands until you nearly singe your sleeves. Then reluctantly you retreat to your bed across the chamber, only to find the temperature drops with every step. By the time you slip under the blankets, you may as well have been sitting outside. Peasants, by contrast, often benefited more from their smaller hearths. A single central fire in a modest cottage heated the whole interior. Smoky though it was, the cramped space meant that flames and bodies together maintained tolerable warmth. The grand, noble fireplaces, by contrast, burned through resources, but left chambers half frozen. Grandeur once again failed to translate into comfort. Still, the ceremony of the flame held meaning. This wasn't simply about generating heat. This was about coming together, about illumination, about the comfort that something fought back against the void. Folks offered prayers beside the fire, told tales around it, dozed in seats next to it, even when the heat couldn't reach across the chamber. The brightness provided mental security, a signal of existence in the hollow chill. So when you picture a medieval evening, don't envision a blazing hearth rescuing you from freezing. Picture instead a delicate pocket of warmth in an ocean of frozen air. Relief that endured only while you remained close, and relief that vanished the instant you entered your bed. The fireplace served as theatre as much as a useful device, and the medieval person learned to appreciate whatever little it could offer. Draw nearer to that glowing hearth, and for a brief instant it seems secure. But then another truth of medieval existence emerges: smoke. Fireplaces weren't clean, effective mechanisms. They spewed vapours, deposited ash, and filled rooms with a fog that burned the eyes and coated every object. To keep warm beside flame meant breathing smoke each night, accepting blackened surfaces, and waking with lungs lined in dust. Writers from that era complained bitterly about this. One monk in northern England observed that his cell became so covered with ash from the fireplace that he coughed more than he worshipped. Even aristocrats weren't spared. Court documents mention women mourning ruined dresses and fabrics stained by constant smoke contact. A freshly cleaned wall hanging might turn grey within one season. The building design worsened things. Chimneys were broad, rough passages without the airflow management of modern vents. Smoke didn't always climb politely. It wandered, swirled, and stuck to the room. When the breeze blew the wrong way, it poured back inside, leaving everyone within wheezing. Picture attempting to fall asleep while smoke scorched your throat and your eyes streamed. An interesting note from travel records reveals that some folks deliberately coated their walls with lime or mud, not just to brighten spaces, but to mask the marks of soot. The black build-up never truly disappeared, but at least the appearance of cleanliness could return for a short time. The odour, though, was lasting. A blend of burnt timber, wet stone and charred fabric that stayed in bedding and clothing. Experts remain split over just how bearable these smoky chambers were. Some claim that medieval people simply adjusted, their bodies and standards toughened to it. Others maintain that even those living then recognised the health cost, pointing to repeated complaints in medical texts about poisoned air and darkened lungs. Maybe both views are correct. People survived because they had little option, but they never quit complaining about it. Now picture yourself resting in bed after such an evening. Your hair carries the scent of smoke. Your covers hold the sharp bite of ash. And when you cough, you taste sourness on your tongue. The bed hangings capture some of it within, so even your tiny shelter carries the spirit of the fire. Your room may have been warmer than before, but it came at the price of clean air. Common folk fared no differently. Their homes often had no chimneys at all. Smoke from the central fire simply rose and filled the beams, slowly escaping through the roof. Children grew up in houses forever hazed with smoke, their lungs darkened before they reached adulthood. Yet people viewed it as ordinary. Some even thought the smoke helped protect the wooden ceiling, keeping bugs away. Survival and belief merged together in every breath. The physical experience was intense. Your skin tingled from ash particles, your eyes watered endlessly, and the floor rushes collected black powder. Workers swept constantly, though the task seemed pointless. Every winter was identical. A fight against smoke, a fight against cold, and the understanding that you couldn't win one without making the other worse. Still, despite the discomfort, fire was essential. No one could survive a castle winter without it. So people made their compromise. They displayed smoky tapestries with pride. They endured coughing spells. They scrubbed soot from their faces each morning. Warmth required sacrifice, and the sacrifice was fresh air. So as you rest in your modern bed tonight, breathing easily without thought, think about how remarkable such comfort is. For medieval sleepers, every warm night meant another smoky dawn. Their dreams were soaked in the smell of burning wood. Their lives were lived in the shadow of ash. When the fire dimmed and the night stretched forward, the only light remaining in a medieval room often came from a candle. You might picture this gentle flame as ornament, a hint of atmosphere, but for many sleepers the candle was also a source of delicate warmth. A single wick couldn't warm an entire room naturally, but in a world where every flicker mattered, even the weakest help counted. Candles in the Middle Ages took many shapes. Rich households burned beeswax, which produced a clear, bright flame and filled the air with a subtle, sweet smell. These were costly, saved for chapels, ceremonies, or noble rooms. More often, people used tallow candles made from melted animal fat. These smoked, flickered, and stank of grease. Picture drifting off to sleep while the harsh smell of burning tallow thickened the air, mixing with the dampness of stone and the earthiness of wool. Yet candles weren't just light. They created a surprising amount of heat nearby. Put one close to your bed curtain, and you might feel the fabric warming slightly to the touch. Some households arranged multiple candles together on holders, making clusters of flames that provided both brightness and a zone of warmth. It was hardly central heating, but it took the edge off the cold in the immediate area around them. An odd story survives from a 14th century letter describing how a noblewoman required 12 candles in her chamber at once during winter nights, claiming that only then could she sleep. The servants complained about the waste, but her demand reveals a reality. People used light as a replacement heater. Even when the result was small, the risks were clear. Candle flames fell over easily, and bed curtains rich with wool and linen were dangerously flammable. Documents describe fires started by careless positioning, turning entire chambers to ashes. One especially dark tale from Germany tells of a squire who fell asleep with a candle on the bed frame. He woke to find his blankets burning and barely escaped alive. The servants blamed him for being reckless, but the real problem was need. He had wanted a bit of warmth within reach. Scholars still argue whether medieval people fully grasped the dangers or whether the regular use of candles created carelessness. Some believe that records of burned fabrics show that accidents were frequent but accepted. Others think the wealthy reduced risk by having servants watch the lights far into the night. Whatever the truth, the tension between danger and comfort was ongoing. Now imagine yourself in such a room. The fire in the hearth has shrunk to glowing coals, leaving only shadows creeping up the walls. A single candle burns on a wooden stand beside your bed. Its glow is gentle and golden, creating a circle that reaches your hands. As you pull the blankets closer, the faint warmth spreads just enough that your face feels less frozen. The flame wavers. Wax drops steadily down the side, and the smell of smoke hangs lightly in the air. Beyond your curtain, the rest of the room disappears into blackness. You listen to the quiet sounds, the soft crack of the wick, the whisper of wind against the shutters, the gentle drip of wax hitting metal. Your world shrinks to this small ring of light and heat. The candle becomes not just brightness, but company, a fragile partner against the vastness of the night. In cottages and taverns, simpler versions of this scene occurred. Travellers set rushlights, cheap reeds dipped in fat beside their straw beds. These burned fast and unevenly, hissing and spitting, but their weak glow brought comfort. Parents lit small lamps near children to drive away both cold and fear. Even monks who valued simplicity allowed lamps to burn in sleeping quarters, claiming both safety and necessity. The mix of sensations was memorable. The air smelled of melted fat and smoke, the walls streaked with soot from months of burning, the bedclothes spotted where wax had splashed. Yet people accepted these flaws. In the harshest winter, the candle was more than decoration. It was survival. So, as you settle under your own clean electric light tonight, picture the uncertain flicker of a medieval flame. It warmed just enough to fool the body into rest, and it threatened disaster with every spark. Sleep in the Middle Ages was never free from worry, even in the smallest details. To close your eyes was to trust that your fragile flame would burn through the night without turning warmth into destruction. If you move away from noble chambers and into shared quarters, you discover another aspect of medieval sleep, the group dormitory. Not everyone enjoyed the privilege of heavy curtains, feather beds, and personal servants. Monks, soldiers, apprentices, and servants often slept in communal spaces where the focus was less on comfort and more on survival. Take the monastery as an example. Religious rules required that brothers live simply, which meant their sleeping halls were enormous rooms lined with rows of beds or mats. The stone floor stretched endlessly, broken only by narrow windows high up. Each monk had his own small cot or straw mattress, sometimes little more than a wooden board with a thin cushion. The beds were placed side by side, so close that one monk could hear the breathing of the next. Privacy was unknown, but warmth came from numbers. Surviving records describe how these halls echoed at night with coughing, snoring, and the rustle of rough woolen blankets. The air was thick, cold, and damp, but the sheer presence of bodies meant the dormitory held more warmth than an isolated chamber ever could. One chronicler noted that the cloister was warmer than the Lord's Tower, for the monks lay together like bundles of grain. In military life, the scene was rougher still. Soldiers housed in castles or campaign camps crowded into barracks halls. Long rows of men stretched across straw beds, weapons piled nearby. Blankets were shared and cloaks served double duty as cover. The smell was strong, sweat, leather, smoke and straw mixing in a brew of humanity. Yet for the exhausted, even this rough fellowship became bearable. To sleep shoulder to shoulder was to survive the night. An interesting detail appears in the rules of certain nightly orders. Candles were kept burning in communal halls, not only for light, but to comfort the men with flame. The glow provided a mental warmth, even if it failed to raise the temperature much. The symbolism of the flame mattered as much as its heat. Historians continue to debate whether communal sleeping was deliberately chosen for warmth or simply a result of necessity. Some argue that the monasteries intended it as a form of discipline, a constant reminder that no monk had personal luxury. Others suggest the warmth of shared space was a practical advantage that happened to align with spiritual ideals. The same uncertainty surrounds soldiers. Did they bunk together out of brotherhood, or because the cold made solitude impossible? Likely it was both. Now picture yourself lying in one of these halls. The straw beneath you rustles as you shift. A neighbour coughs. Another turns, the sound echoed by the arched ceiling. The smell of smoke and sweat hangs heavy, but the air is less biting than in a solitary chamber. Your wool blanket scratches your chin and you tuck it tighter, grateful for the shared warmth, even as you wish for quiet. The rhythm of the dormitory is unmistakable. Snores rise and fall like ocean waves, punctuated by the occasional murmur of a dream. Somewhere a rat scurries across the floor rushes, ignored by men too tired to care. The draught still seeps in through the high windows, but the collective body heat softens its bite. You may not feel cosy, but you feel safe. Safer than you would alone in a vast, echoing stone room. Apprentices and household servants lived similarly. Castles were filled with side chambers and lofts where young boys or maids rolled out straw mats, sometimes beneath staircases or in storage rooms. They layered cloaks and huddled together, turning humble corners into makeshift bedrooms. Unlike nobles, they could not demand warming pans or feather beds, but they had the advantage of closeness. Their sleeping quarters were smaller, more crowded, and therefore warmer. The physical experience of these communal spaces was unforgettable. Rough wool against skin, the musky smell of bodies pressed close, the low hum of breathing, the scratch of straw, the faint drip of water from the ceiling. It was not peace in the modern sense, but it was endurance. People did not expect silence or solitude, they expected survival. So tonight, as you rest in your own bed, think of those long halls of monks chanting prayers before putting out the lights, of soldiers collapsing in rows after battle, of servants curling together in hidden corners. Their warmth came not from silk or fur, but from each other. Sleep in medieval times was as much about community as about comfort. A reminder that even in the coldest castles, survival was rarely a solitary act. You've settled into this crowded dormitory in your mind. But even here, Warmth isn't guaranteed. Fires must be maintained, and in the middle of the night, someone always had to get up, stumble across the floor, and stir the embers. Medieval sleep was rarely unbroken. People woke frequently, not just from the discomfort of straw or the coughs of neighbours, but from the practical need of keeping the fire alive. The medieval body rhythm was different from ours. People didn't expect a straight 8 hours of rest. Instead, they lived with what some scholars call divided sleep. A first sleep came after sunset, lasting a few hours until midnight or so. Then many awoke, sometimes to tend fires, sometimes to pray, sometimes to check livestock or children. After an hour or two of quiet wakefulness, they returned to a second sleep until dawn. In the freezing months, this break often centred around fire care. Without it, embers died and chambers became unbearable. One well-known record comes from the writings of a 15th century doctor who recommended using the gap between first and second sleep for thinking, conversation, or even intimacy. To him, this wakeful period was natural, but to the castle servant trudging across icy floors to feed logs into a hearth, it was less philosophy and more duty. He heard the crackle of fresh wood, blew into the embers, and prayed they would catch. An interesting custom appears in some rural records. Families assigned watch duties, especially in large halls. Each adult took turns rising to check the fire. In monasteries, bells rang at intervals through the night, calling monks to prayer and coincidentally ensuring someone was always awake to mind the heat. Sleep was not a private withdrawal from the world, but a shared rhythm punctuated by responsibility. Historians debate whether divided sleep was universal or more common in Northern Europe, where winter nights stretched long. Some argue it was dictated by necessity. The length of darkness simply made a single stretch of sleep impractical. Others suggest it was cultural habit, not entirely dependent on geography. The debate continues, but what remains clear is that tending the fire was at the heart of these nighttime rhythms. Picture yourself waking in the dead of night. The room is silent except for snores. You push back the blanket, feel the icy slap of air against your skin, and fumble for a log. Your feet crunch on straw, your breath rises in clouds, and your hands sting as you stir the dying embers. Sparks flare, logs catch reluctantly, and warmth pulses again into the room. You sigh with relief, knowing that for a few more hours your companions will rest undisturbed. The sensory detail is memorable. The pop of wood, the faint glow pushing shadows back, the smell of smoke mixing with wool. Your fingers ache, but the satisfaction of reviving the fire steadies you. When you crawl back beneath the blankets, the bed feels all the warmer. By contrast, peasants in cottages lived by the same rhythm. Their hearths had no protective screens, only open flames on the floor, so a careless sleeper risked the fire dying or worse, spreading. A family member always rose to adjust logs, poke embers, and keep watch. Sleep came in fits and starts, always tied to the heartbeat of the fire. And so you realise that medieval nights were not passive stretches of unconsciousness. They were negotiated, managed, and guarded. People rose, worked, prayed, checked on animals, whispered to loved ones, and then returned to slumber in the darkness. Life did not pause, it simply slowed, punctuated by firelight and breath. As you lie in your warm bed tonight, picture the constant vigilance required in those stone halls. To close your eyes was never absolute. To sleep was to trust that someone would wake, feed the fire and keep the cold from claiming the room. Before dawn, you've tended the fire, crawled back beneath the blankets, and tried to calm your racing thoughts. Yet there was another medieval approach to warmth, not born of practicality, but of desire for luxury. For some, the dream of a hot bath before bed lingered like a forbidden pleasure. Bathing was complex in the Middle Ages. Heating water required enormous fuel, and tubs were large, awkward things. A warm soak was far from a daily habit. It was a special occasion, and often communal. But for those who could afford it, slipping into steaming water on a winter night was a kind of magic. Chronicles describe noblewomen lowering themselves into wooden tubs lined with cloth, steam curling up in the lamplight, attendants standing by with heated towels. To step out of such a bath and then slide between sheets was to feel briefly that winter had lost its grip. An interesting record from Paris notes that wealthy citizens sometimes ordered tubs placed near fireplaces so that the bather emerged into a chamber already glowing with heat. The air smelled of rosemary or thyme, herbs tossed into the water for fragrance and supposed healing benefit. For a short while, skin tingled with warmth, cheeks flushed, and the body felt prepared for restful sleep. Of course, such pleasures were rare. More often, people sought smaller comforts before bed. A cup of heated ale, spiced wine, or hot honey wine was a common indulgence. The heat travelled inward, spreading warmth through the chest, lulling the body toward drowsiness. Some households kept stones near the hearth, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them at the foot of the bed, primitive hot water bottles that radiated heat for hours. One rather strange account tells of noble families filling leather pouches with heated sand to tuck between sheets. The sand retained warmth longer than stones and moulded to the body's shape. Picture stretching your frozen feet towards such a pouch, sighing as the cold slowly eased. The creativity is striking. When faced with hostile winters, people experimented with whatever materials they had. Modern historians still argue over just how common such bedtime luxuries were. Were they occasional treats for the very richest, or did middle-class families also practice them in modest form? Some suggest that warming drinks and heated stones were widespread, accessible to most households. Others believe they remained rare indulgences, remembered precisely because they were unusual. The debate reminds us that comfort itself was a contested privilege. Picture yourself in this imagined chamber. You sit before the hearth as a servant pours mulled wine into a cup. The scent of cinnamon and cloves fills the air, masking the smell of smoke and damp wool. You sip slowly, warmth blooming through your chest. Your eyes grow heavy, your limbs relax. And when you finally climb into bed, the blankets feel less oppressive, more inviting. At the foot of the bed, a stone wrapped in cloth radiates gentle heat against your toes. For once, you do not dread the night. The sensory impressions are vivid. The sweet tang of spiced wine, the hiss of a log collapsing into embers, the tingling warmth of heated stone. You drift into slumber with your senses satisfied, your body convinced, however briefly, that comfort is possible. But here's the reality. Such indulgences were fragile. Heat faded quickly, drinks cooled, and by midnight the chamber was cold again. What these rituals offered was not permanent relief, but a kind of psychological grace, moments of ease that made the endless chill tolerable. So as you rest tonight, think of how deeply medieval people yearned for warmth. They engineered clever tools, sought fleeting indulgences, and transformed even a hot drink into a strategy for survival. Their nights were not effortless, but they were resourceful, and every bath, every stone, every sip of ale was a small rebellion against the cold. Even after baths, heated stones, or mulled drinks, medieval people never relied on practical measures alone. Cold was not just a physical enemy, it was a spiritual and supernatural one too. Night was dangerous, the air itself suspected of harbouring illness and evil forces, and so people turned to charms, rituals and superstitions to protect them as they slept. One commonly recorded practice was hanging amulets above the bed. These might be simple crosses carved from wood, small relics said to contain holy power, or even herbs bound in little pouches. Rue, mugwort and juniper were popular choices, believed to drive away not only evil spirits, but also the night air thought to be poisonous. Picture lying in bed beneath a canopy strung with fragrant bundles, the scent mixing with the smoke of the hearth and the earthiness of wool blankets. Prayers were another shield. Monastic rules encouraged reciting psalms before lying down, and noble families often repeated Our Fathers or Hail Marys at the bedside. But even peasants whispered charms, half prayer, half spell, as they crossed themselves against frost or fever. Some murmured verses over children, pressing kisses on their foreheads to keep the night hag away, a figure blamed for suffocating sleepers. A curious detail appears in a German household manual from the 15th century. Sleepers were advised to place iron objects, such as a knife or scissors, beneath the bed or pillow. Iron was thought to repel demons and fairies that slipped into rooms during the long hours of darkness. The metal glinted faintly in the firelight, a silent guard against unseen intruders. And then there were rituals tied directly to warmth. One folk belief insisted that turning your shoes upside down beside the bed would keep frost from biting your toes. Another claimed that if you whispered the names of 3 saints before blowing out the candle, your body heat would not flee in the night. To us, these sound like quaint superstitions. To them, they were strategies as vital as an extra blanket. Scholars remain divided on how seriously people took such practices. Some argue that charms and prayers were heartfelt, deeply ingrained in the rhythm of daily life. Others suggest they were more like habits, gestures performed out of custom, even if not fully believed. Either way, the rituals reveal something essential. Sleep was never trusted. It was a vulnerable state where cold, illness, and spirits could all strike. People needed both physical and spiritual defences. Picture yourself lying in a medieval bed now. The curtains are drawn, the fire is low, and the chamber is filled with shadows. Above you hangs a sprig of juniper, its sharp scent cutting through the smoky air. Beneath your pillow rests a small iron knife, hidden but comforting. You whisper a prayer, words soft and rhythmic, and then cross yourself before pulling the blankets tighter. The night feels less threatening, as though the rituals have carved a circle of safety around your fragile body. The sensory details deepen the experience, the rustle of herbs brushing against the canopy, the faint metallic smell of iron near your head, the warmth of wool against your skin, and the lingering echo of whispered words. In that moment, faith, superstition, and survival are all intertwined. Peasants practiced the same, though with different materials. Instead of relics, they hung crude charms, carved wooden figures, knotted cords, or simple herbs gathered from fields. Parents tucked garlic under children's pillows, believing it warded off both sickness and spirits. Even animals were included. Cows and sheep in barns were sometimes blessed before nightfall, their presence thought to strengthen the household against frost. In every class of society, the cold night was not just endured with cloth and fire, but with ritual. The medieval mind sought warmth in the body and safety in the unseen. To sleep was to step into mystery, where prayer and herb, iron and flame all worked together against the long darkness. So when you tuck yourself in tonight, picture those little gestures, the flipped shoes, the sprig of rosemary, the whispered saint's name. They were small comforts, no less real for being intangible. For the medieval sleeper, survival was never purely physical. It was also spiritual armour, woven from faith, habit, and hope. Step back from the bed itself and look at the chamber as a whole. Beyond blankets, dogs, or charms, the architecture of a room shaped how well its occupants could endure the night. Castles were built first for defence, but over time, builders experimented with ways to make the interiors more livable. The result was a patchwork of features, some clever, some symbolic, that aimed to carve warmth out of stone, One such feature was the solar, a private room often set aside for the lord and his family. Unlike the cavernous Great Hall, the solar was smaller, higher in the building, and easier to heat. It usually had its own fireplace, thick hangings on the walls, and windows facing the sun. This wasn't luxury in the modern sense. It was strategy. By reducing the size of the room, the fire's heat had a fighting chance of lingering. Tapestries became more than decoration. Woven from wool or silk, they lined the walls with colour and stories, saints, hunts, mythical beasts. But they also served as insulation. A tapestry might be 10 or 20 feet wide, heavy enough that servants struggled to hang it. Behind it, the damp stone was hidden, and the air near the wall grew a little less icy. Step close to one, and you could even smell the lanolin of the wool, earthy and faintly comforting. Archaeological evidence reveals that countless chambers featured wooden panels installed for practical reasons. Oak planks formed protective barriers, capturing air pockets and making spaces feel less cavern-like. Workers packed crevices with moss fibre or fabric scraps to block wind currents. The outcome was imperfect, yet it showed the extraordinary measures people took to convert hostile fortresses into livable spaces. A fascinating detail appears in household records. Aristocrats frequently transported their finest tapestries between castles, treating them like movable barriers. These weren't merely decorative pieces, they were essential equipment. A nobleman travelling without his wall hangings was like a warrior without protection. Experts in medieval household studies continue debating exactly how effective these architectural elements were. Some maintain they genuinely minimised drafts and preserved warmth. Others argue the mental relief mattered more than any actual temperature change. Entering a room adorned with vibrant fabric and glowing with firelight could feel warmer, even if the measurable heat remained unchanged. This argument highlights the complex relationship between mind and endurance. Now envision yourself entering such a space. The heavy door swings shut, dampening the wind's howl from the hallway. Crimson and golden tapestries drape the walls, their woven scenes flickering in candlelight. Flames dance in a stone fireplace, smoke spiralling toward the ceiling above. The wooden beams seem closer than in the Great Hall, creating intimacy. Cold persists. Your breath forms visible clouds, though less brutally than in the exposed rooms downstairs. The experience engages multiple senses. Rough tapestry texture under your palm, the subtle scent of wool mixing with smoke, the sharp crack of burning oak logs. You almost convince yourself this room offers sanctuary, though winter lurks just beyond the hangings. Common folk copied this approach in simpler ways. Rather than elaborate tapestries, they covered walls with plaster or wattle, then draped rough wool or patched fabric to minimise drafts. A colourfully painted cloth with basic designs served both as insulation and ornamentation. In their own manner, peasants transformed naked walls into protective shells, compressing space into something bearable. Another clever design trick involved positioning sleeping quarters on higher floors. Heat rising from the Great Hall below provided at least minimal advantage. Children often slept in lofts above kitchens where oven warmth lingered. The arrangement prioritised heat conservation over privacy, exploiting every trace of residual warmth. Yet despite these innovations, cold never disappeared. You could only reduce, never eliminate, its hold. Still, the existence of wall hangings, private chambers and wooden panelling demonstrates how desperately people yearn to transform stone dungeons into homes. So tonight as you rest, picture those rooms glowing with tapestries, warmed slightly by fires, softened by timber boards and colourful cloth. They weren't comfortable by today's standards, but they represented acts of resistance. Against stone, against frost, against endless winter darkness, the medieval household created layers, architectural, artistic, and psychological. To declare this place is ours, and here, at minimum, we will survive. Close your eyes and consider the aroma of a medieval sleeping chamber. It wasn't the lavender-scented paradise of contemporary bedding advertisements. Instead, it was a thick mixture of odours present from the instant you stepped through the massive wooden door. To comprehend how people slept, you must understand what they inhaled, because every breath reminded them of their living conditions. The initial scent was invariably smoke. Fires burned nearly continuously in winter, and without proper chimneys, soot drifted back into rooms, darkening walls, thickening air, and embedding itself in blanket and curtain fibres. Even newly washed linen quickly absorbed the bitter taste of ash. You'd settle into bed each night with smoke clinging to your hair, garments, even flesh. Then came the smell of wet wool. Blankets, cloaks and clothing were seldom completely dry during winter. Moisture seeped through stone walls, condensed on surfaces and saturated textiles. Wool retains that damp odour stubbornly, earthy, lanolin-heavy, mildly sour. Imagine pulling covers to your chin and breathing fabric that felt warm but never quite clean. Add the scent of straw and rushes. Floors were carpeted with them, beds stuffed with them, and they rarely remained fresh. Trampled by boots, soaked with spills and inhabited by rodents, rushes grew musty rapidly. Straw mattresses released grassy fragrances initially, but after weeks of use, they reeked of perspiration and rot. Each movement in bed released another cloud of that earthy smell into the atmosphere. One intriguing note in a 14th century household guide suggested sprinkling dried herbs, rosemary, lavender or sweetgrass onto rushes to freshen the chamber briefly. It worked. The fragrance blended with heavier odours, masking them just enough to seem refined. But soon the herbs withered, crushed underfoot, their scent fading into the background while the staleness of old rushes returned. Then there was human odour. Cleanliness was limited, baths rare, and sweating constant. People slept in layers of clothing that absorbed daily smells: leather, wool, unwashed flesh. Beds shared by families or companions intensified this. Breathing the air of a medieval chamber meant inhaling the scent of other bodies, sometimes reassuring, sometimes overwhelming. Researchers debate just how overpowering these smells actually were. Some contend that medieval people accustomed to constant exposure hardly noticed. Others believe contemporaries were quite aware, which explains why they valued herbs, perfumes, and incense so highly. Evidence from inventories and medical writings suggests the latter. People complained about foul air, sought solutions, and took measures to counteract it. The debate itself reminds us that smell wasn't secondary. It was fundamental to the medieval sleeping experience. Now place yourself in such a room. The fire has dimmed, leaving only smoke's bitter trace. The damp wool blanket scratches your chin. Straw beneath releases a musty sigh each time you turn. Rushes on the floor whisper softly as mice dart through crumbs. Your bedmate exhales nearby, warm but heavy with sweat and ale. Above everything floats a faint hint of rosemary scattered days earlier, now barely concealing the stew of odours. The sensory reality overwhelms. It fills your nostrils and lungs, burning itself into memory. You cough, rearrange the covers, and try breathing lightly until sleep arrives. This was ordinary. This was existence. Peasants encountered the same, though on a smaller scale. Their cottages filled with livestock smells, since animals often shared the same building. Cattle, sheep and chickens added their odours, creating a sharp mixture that urban visitors found intolerable, but villagers accepted as survival necessity. Yet even here, herbs helped. Bunches of mint or chamomile might dangle from beams, partly for fragrance, partly to repel insects. For nobles, perfumes and incense occasionally improved conditions. Incense burning in braziers added sweetness to the air, though it mixed strangely with smoke and dampness. Perfumed oils dabbed on clothes or linens created islands of pleasant scent in an otherwise heavy atmosphere. But even the wealthiest chamber couldn't escape the basic odours of medieval life. So when you imagine sleeping in a castle, don't picture crisp linen and fresh air. Picture instead a blend of smoke, damp wool, straw, sweat, herbs, and animals. Every night, every breath reminded you of where you lived and what you endured. Smell was as much part of medieval sleep as blankets or fire, and perhaps over time the very familiarity of those odours brought a kind of comfort. To breathe smoke and wool and straw was to breathe home. For the medieval sleeper, scent wasn't just inconvenience, it was identity woven into every night's rest. Beyond the smoke, damp wool, and musty straw, another element helped medieval people survive the night: food and drink. You might not consider supper part of sleep, but what you consumed before bed and what warmth it provided inside your body mattered as much as any blanket during winter. Households depended on hearty stews, thick broths of barley, peas and root vegetables simmered slowly in large cauldrons. These meals clung to the body, creating a heavy satisfaction that made cold easier to endure. The broth's heat lingered in the stomach, spreading outward, convincing you that you could tolerate a freezing chamber a bit longer. A noble household might enrich the dish with meat, spices or cream, while peasants relied on onions, cabbage and whatever scraps were available. One curious note in a 15th century English manuscript advises eating leeks at night because they warm the belly and ward off death's chill. Whether this claim held truth, it shows how strongly people connected diet with warmth and survival. A hot meal wasn't simply nourishment, it was insulation from within. Beverages played an equally crucial role. Ale was most common, consumed by rich and poor alike. Served heated in winter, it filled stomachs with calories and provided liquid comfort. Spiced wine or hippocras became a noble favourite, warmed gently and seasoned with cinnamon, ginger and cloves imported from distant lands. Imagine sipping such a drink in a smoky chamber, the aroma of exotic spices mingling with wool and ash, the sweetness burning your throat, leaving you drowsy and warm. There's even a record from the court of Charles VI of France, where the king's doctor recommended hot mead at night to prevent chill from entering the bones. The concept wasn't far from our modern habit of drinking tea before bed, though medieval science wrapped it in humoral theory, the belief that warm, moist drinks balanced the body's internal fluids. Scholars still debate how much alcohol contributed to warmth versus simply creating the illusion of it. Some argue that ale and wine dulled perception, making sleepers believe they were warmer than they were. Others point to the genuine caloric benefit of these drinks, which did provide energy through long, cold nights. The truth may lie somewhere between, a mix of actual warmth and psychological comfort. Now imagine yourself preparing for bed. A servant offers you a wooden cup of mulled wine. The surface steams, sending waves of spiced aroma into your nose. You drink slowly, the liquid glowing as it slides down your throat. Your body relaxes, muscles loosening, eyelids growing heavy. When you finally climb into bed, the blankets feel less oppressive, more welcoming, as though warmth already lives inside you. For peasants, the ritual was simpler but no less important. A bowl of hot porridge thickened with oats or barley filled the stomach. Families gathered around the fire to eat, their faces glowing in the light, their bodies fueled for the long night ahead. Children licked final scraps from wooden spoons before curling under blankets. The memory of warmth from food helped them ignore drafts sneaking through shutters. A curious folk belief held that garlic eaten before bed prevented frostbite. Whether this was because garlic genuinely improved circulation, or simply because it warmed the palate, the habit persisted. Farmers in cold regions sometimes chewed garlic cloves before lying down, the pungent scent filling the chamber as strongly as smoke or wool. The sensory world of medieval bedtime food is vivid. The bubbling cauldron, the hiss of wine heating over flames, the smell of herbs and spices mingling with damp rushes, the heavy weight of stew in the stomach. Every flavour was part of the battle against cold. So when you think of medieval sleep, don't separate it from the supper that preceded it. Food was fuel, warmth, and even a form of medicine. Without it, cold was sharper, blankets thinner, nights longer. With it, the body persevered. Every spoonful, every swallow was another layer of defence, an inner blanket, invisible but essential against the freezing stone surrounding you. Consider now the most vulnerable people inside a medieval castle, the children and elderly. Their bodies, less resistant to cold, often suffered winter's worst cruelty. If a healthy adult knight or servant shivered through the night, a child might wake blue-lipped, and an old woman might not wake at all. Survival for these groups depended on extra care, communal support, and sometimes pure luck. Household records from noble families show that children were rarely given private chambers. Instead, they slept in nurseries, close to kitchen warmth, or clustered with servants. Young pages and squires destined for training often bunked together in crowded rooms, their laughter and chatter muffled by blankets at night. The logic was simple. More bodies meant more heat. Babies especially were wrapped in layer upon layer of linen and wool. A cradle stood near the hearth, or in some cases directly inside the mother's bed, where her body heat shielded the infant from freezing air. One touching account from a 14th century chronicle describes a noble child laid by the fire in a wicker crib, wrapped in furs and covered with a canopy. The detail suggests the lengths families went to protect their youngest. Yet even so, illness and cold claimed many lives. Medieval parents lived with constant fear that winter might take a child in the night. The elderly faced similar dangers. Frail bodies produced less heat and tolerated fewer drafts. In peasant cottages, grandparents often slept closest to the fire, while younger adults accepted colder spots. In castles, aged relatives were placed in smaller chambers or even moved into kitchens during the coldest months. A curious letter from Burgundy tells of an elderly matron who insisted on sleeping in the bakehouse, arguing that the oven's residual heat gave her a second youth. Medical texts of the period often advised special measures for the old and young. Doctors recommended heated stones wrapped in cloth to be placed at their feet, or mulled drinks to fortify the humours. They warned that sudden chills could extinguish the flame of life. A vivid reminder of how vulnerable these groups were. Historians continue debating whether medieval families treated children and elders with extra indulgence or simply folded them into the same survival strategies as everyone else. Some argue that the emphasis on protecting them reflects deep compassion. Others point out that mortality rates remained high, suggesting limits to what families could realistically do. The tension between care and inevitability shaped how people viewed age and childhood. Now imagine the scene of a winter's night in a peasant cottage. A baby lies swaddled tightly, his tiny face barely visible. A grandmother snores softly by the hearth, the faint glow of embers painting her cheeks red. Parents tuck cloaks over both, ensuring they receive the warmest spots. Children crowd together on a straw mattress, giggling until exhaustion silences them. The chamber smells of porridge, smoke and wool, but the warmth of family togetherness lingers. In a castle, the image differs, but remains equally vivid. A nursemaid rocks a cradle near the fire, humming softly, while a child whimpers against the chill. Upstairs, an elderly noblewoman insists her bed curtains be drawn tight while a servant places hot stones at her feet. She mutters prayers, clutching a rosary, fearful of cold's creeping hand. In both worlds, the youngest and oldest require the most attention, and sometimes even that isn't enough. The sensory detail is striking, the crackle of logs as they're added to the fire, the soft rustle of swaddling cloth, the wheeze of an old man adjusting under blankets. You feel the fragility in the air, as though cold waits for a moment of weakness to strike. So when you think of medieval sleep, remember that it wasn't equal for all. Children and elders carried the heaviest risks, their survival dependent on warmth provided by others. In those long nights, every blanket, every ember, every whispered prayer mattered. They remind us that medieval sleep wasn't only about individual endurance, but about community. The young and old carried through winter by the care and vigilance of those around them. Cold didn't just gnaw at skin and bone, it shaped how people thought about health itself. To a medieval mind, chill wasn't simply uncomfortable, it was dangerous, a force that could disturb the body's inner balance and invite disease. Medicine in this era revolved around the theory of four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And doctors believed temperature played a vital role in keeping those fluids in harmony. Too much cold meant your humours thickened, clogging the body and making you sick. Medical treatises from the 13th and 14th centuries are filled with advice on combating this problem at night. One manual suggested rubbing feet with warm oil before bed to open pores and expel harmful chill. Another recommended drinking heated milk with honey, claiming it soothed the stomach and kept humours from becoming sluggish. Doctors viewed warmth as medicine itself, prescribing heat in every form: food, drink, clothing, and even proximity to others. There's a fascinating record from a French surgeon who warned that sleeping in damp chambers could breed melancholy. By chilling the black bile, he advised hanging tapestries not for beauty, but for medical necessity. Imagine being told by your doctor that failing to decorate your walls properly might make you depressed. It shows how deeply climate and medicine were intertwined. At the same time, folk cures flourished. Some people believed rubbing garlic or onion on foot soles before sleep prevented chills from entering the body. Others tied charms of wool soaked in wine around their wrists. A curious prescription from an English herbal advises keeping a live rooster in the bedroom to draw frost away from humans. Whether anyone truly slept with a squawking chicken nearby is uncertain, but the belief reveals just how desperate people were for remedies. Modern scholars still debate how effective medieval health practices against cold really were. Some argue that oils, heated drinks, and herbal remedies did provide modest relief, easing circulation and offering psychological comfort. Others insist most of these treatments were symbolic, offering little real benefit beyond placebo. The disagreement continues, but what's certain is that people believed wholeheartedly in the power of these nightly rituals. Now imagine yourself preparing for bed under such advice. You sit by the hearth while a servant massages warm oil into your feet, the smell of rosemary filling the chamber. You drink a small cup of heated wine sweetened with honey, feeling it coat your throat. A sprig of garlic rests near the bed, pungent and strange, meant to ward off frost. You climb into bed, convinced that these remedies will keep your humours balanced until morning. The sensory experience is intense. The slick warmth of oil on your skin, the sweet tang of honeyed wine, the sharp bite of garlic in the air. Every detail reminds you that sleep wasn't only a battle against discomfort, but a medical practice, a nightly therapy against the threat of imbalance. Peasants too had their own remedies. Women brewed herbal teas of nettle or chamomile for children, believing the warmth prevented coughs. Men wrapped their legs in wool soaked in vinegar to keep circulation strong. In cottages, these practices blurred the line between superstition and science, but they gave people agency in a world where illness often felt inevitable. The irony, of course, is that many ailments came from the very strategies used to combat cold. Fires filled lungs with smoke. Heavy blankets triggered joint pain, and oily ointments collected dirt. Yet to medieval minds, these were minor costs compared to the greater peril of frost seeping into the body. Better to cough in a smoky room than freeze in a clean one. So when you picture medieval sleep, remember it wasn't just a matter of enduring discomfort. It was wrapped in theories of health, remedies both strange and familiar, and constant anxiety that cold might tip the balance of life itself. Every night was a medical event, every blanket and herb a prescription, every ember a treatment, and to drift into slumber was to trust that these efforts were enough to carry you through until morning. Even with fires, blankets, herbs and charms, there were nights when none of it was enough. Step into a castle chamber at winter's peak, and you might see something eerie. Frost blooming on the inside walls. Imagine lying in bed and noticing delicate ice lace tracing the stones. Or waking to find your wash basin, frozen solid, the water inside turned to a glassy block. Cold didn't stay politely outdoors. It invaded, decorating rooms with its own cruel artistry. Chroniclers record moments when entire households woke to frost on their bed curtains. One noblewoman wrote in a letter that her canopy glittered as though sewn with silver, meaning moisture from her own breath had crystallized overnight. To us, it sounds poetic. To her, it was miserable proof of how inhospitable even a well-furnished chamber could be. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. In certain preserved castles, faint salt streaks and moisture stains suggest how water condensed on walls and floors without insulation. Warm indoor air met freezing stone and frost took hold. Servants scraped ice away in mornings, only for it to return each night. A curious anecdote survives from Scandinavia. In some halls, icicles formed on rafters indoors, dripping onto unlucky sleepers below. Servants hung cloths to catch the meltwater, a primitive solution to an unnerving problem. Imagine drifting off and hearing the faint crack of ice above, wondering if a shard would fall onto your bed. Scholars still discuss how common this phenomenon was. Some believe frost indoors was typical only of northern Europe, where winters were harsher. Others argue that even in temperate regions, poorly heated stone chambers easily reached freezing temperatures. The truth may be both. Severity varied by region, but the risk of waking to ice inside your room was never far away. Now put yourself in that situation. You wake in the dim grey of dawn, breath fogging in the air. The bed curtains are stiff, edged with frozen crystals. When you reach for the wash basin, your fingers touch ice instead of water. Your joints ache from cold, and the thought of leaving the covers feels like punishment. The sensory detail is vivid. The sharp sting of frozen fabric against your skin, the brittle creak of wood shrunk by frost, the silence broken only by the faint drip of melting ice. Peasants lived with the same problem, though in different forms. In cottages, frost coated the inside of thatch and rafters, drifting down like snow during the night. Children sometimes woke with frost clinging to their hair. Parents joked grimly about sleeping with clouds indoors. Yet humour couldn't disguise the hardship. Frostbite, chilblains and respiratory illness followed in its wake. Nobles, despite their wealth, couldn't entirely escape it. Hot stones and furs kept the body alive, but surrounding air remained hostile. Diaries hint at the psychological toll. People spoke of dreading the moment they had to leave bed in the morning, of feeling imprisoned by blankets because the room beyond was too cruel to face. One English poet even turned it into metaphor, writing of love as a bed without frost inside the hangings. For him, true intimacy meant defying the nightly chill, creating warmth where the world offered only ice. It reveals how deeply the experience of frost-shaped imagination as well as reality. So as you think of medieval sleep, remember the surreal beauty of those nights when cold decorated the very walls. To live in a castle was to share your chamber with ice, to wake each morning reminded that stone and frost were allies against your comfort. And yet people endured, scraping ice away, layering blankets, whispering prayers, and braving mornings that felt as harsh indoors as out. Envision yourself beyond castle walls now, travelling dusty paths far from home's comfort. Medieval journeys were grueling, perilous, and exhausting. When darkness descended, finding warmth became a desperate necessity. Nobles enjoyed their stone hearths and hanging tapestries. Common folk gathered around family fires. Yet wanderers, holy pilgrims, traders, and roaming warriors had to find refuge wherever fortune allowed. Most often that meant roadside taverns. The medieval tavern wasn't the charming retreat you might picture. Rather, it stood as a wooden building with hazy common rooms, cramped quarters, and sleeping arrangements shared among complete strangers. Travellers found themselves squeezed together, sometimes 4 bodies to 1 straw mattress, thin coverings barely adequate, personal space utterly absent. Yet these establishments offered something vital: communal warmth. Central fires burned bright for all, and huddled masses created collective heat. A 15th century Italian merchant grumbled about beds crawling with insects, yet acknowledged that fellow lodgers prevented him from freezing solid. Picture yourself settling onto rough straw, pressing against 2 unknowns while ale fumes and body odour assault your senses. Revolting, perhaps, but your extremities would survive until morning. Stranger lodgings existed as well. Some taverns lacked proper rooms entirely, forcing guests into animal quarters. This sounds degrading initially, but many travellers actually chose such arrangements. Livestock generated significant warmth, and barns filled with cattle could prove far more comfortable than drafty upper chambers. Pilgrims walking towards Santiago sometimes deliberately selected stable stalls, nestling among hay bales alongside animals, their breathing mixing with the beasts. The stench was overwhelming, but the temperature was undeniably pleasant. In countryside regions, older customs of hospitality prevailed. Villagers felt obligated to welcome wanderers, particularly religious travellers or those bearing sacred symbols. Peasant households might provide hearth space or room on straw bedding. Heat came not from luxury goods, but from kindness and physical proximity. You'd rest elbow to elbow with strangers, listening to crackling humble fires, remnants of evening meals still perfuming the air overhead. One fascinating 14th century French record describes shared lodging houses where lengthy wooden platforms were arranged, covered in straw, allowing dozens of wayfarers to lie together, men and women side by side. The concept of strangers pressed close might disturb modern sensibilities, but then it was completely ordinary. Collective warmth trumped any social discomfort. Historians debate whether such accommodations offered greater comfort than noble residences. Some maintain they did. Though overcrowded and unsanitary, these places retained heat more effectively than enormous aristocratic bedrooms. Others emphasize the hazards: lice, fleas, robbery, arguing that castle living, despite its chill, at least provided security. Both viewpoints hold merit. For exhausted medieval wanderers, survival often required choosing between frigid solitude and uncomfortable crowds. Now, place yourself inside one of these establishments. You step into the main room, welcomed by roaring conversations and blazing flame. Aromas of ale, smoke, and cooked meat surround you completely. Someone makes space on a straw mat, and you wedge yourself between strangers. Wooden boards groan, hounds yelp, drinking vessels clank together. Still, the crowd's warmth allows your muscles to ease. Later, when the hall settles and snoring replaces merriment, you sense the heat from bodies pressed near, dying coals glowing dimly in the fireplace. It isn't luxury as you understand it, yet it suffices. The physical sensations are vivid. Straw poking through thin cloth, thick smells of perspiration and ash. Steady breathing from a dozen sleepers. You adjust position, careful not to wake your neighbour, until eventually the tavern's murmur draws you into light but essential rest. Even nobility encountered this reality while travelling. Royal expeditions demanded enormous retinues, quickly overwhelming incapacity. Historical records show monarchs staying in religious houses or taking over entire homes for their entourages. Yet even crowned heads couldn't avoid the basic challenge. Heat remained scarce, and travel stripped away layers of social advantage. So within the fabric of medieval slumber, remember the journeyer. For them, every evening brought uncertainty, each bed a risk. Would it be a bug-infested pallet, a stable with horses, a stranger's cottage floor, or with luck, a monastery guest chamber? Whatever the place, the objective stayed constant: to capture sufficient warmth to witness another sunrise. Every family developed survival methods. Not all succeeded, though. The medieval era produced accounts, part historical fact, part folklore, of those who faced nights so harsh they became legendary warnings. Sleeping in a fortress meant battling an unseen enemy. Sometimes the cold emerged victorious. One dark chronicle from 13th century records tells of sentries positioned on castle battlements in Flanders who froze solid at their stations during a brutal winter assault. Come daybreak, their fellow soldiers discovered them motionless, erect, weapons in grip, forms rigid with ice. The chronicler recorded this not as disaster, but as evidence of winter's ruthlessness, as if cold itself wielded military force. Picture that haunting scene. Men turned to sculptures overnight, their watchfires long dead. There were gentler, more intimate stories too. A letter from a Burgundian lady describes how her Italian cousin, visiting from the south, shivered uncontrollably through the darkness and pleaded for dawn, having never experienced such brutal frost. The gentleman lived, yet the tale was repeated with amusement, ridiculing his frailty while quietly recognizing the horror of seemingly eternal night. A strange folk legend from northern lands speaks of a bride who entered her new spouse's castle, only to faint from the shock of the icy chamber. Local people murmured that she'd been hexed by Arctic spirits. Whether she perished from sickness or simple exposure, the story endured as caution. Even noble unions could be challenged by stone barriers and winter gales. Academics remain split on how literally these accounts should be interpreted. Were they embellished for effect, transforming common hardship into myth? Or do they document genuine catastrophic deaths from frostbite and freezing? In an era lacking insulation, some believe chroniclers exaggerated tales for moral instruction, while others view them as precise records of climate more severe than today's. Now picture yourself listening to such stories in a grand hall. The fire burns dim, shadows play across walls, and an elderly servant recounts the tale of a knight who died in slumber because he trusted insufficient coverings. Children listen with wide eyes, gripping their wraps more tightly. These narratives function not merely as entertainment, but as instruction. Respect the cold, or it will claim you. Even traveller testimonies sometimes carried this cautionary tone. Pilgrims wrote of companions lost on mountain routes, their remains found come spring, curled as though still sleeping. Soldiers on military campaigns described brothers in arms who never arose from their sleeping roles, their cloaks frozen stiff, the boundary between rest and death blurred dangerously when temperatures plummeted. The physical details of such nights are bone-chilling, frost stinging exposed flesh, numbness creeping through digits and toes, the terror of shutting your eyes and never reopening them. To lie down in a freezing room was to take chances. Blankets, fires, and prayers were your wages. Living was the reward. Yet alongside these dark tales existed stories of perseverance. Peasants bragged of winters weathered in modest homes where closeness and flame kept families breathing. Nobles celebrated midwinter hunts and banquets, demonstrating that wealth could overcome the season. For every report of death, voices proclaimed strength, presenting survival itself as triumph. Perhaps that explains why legends of freezing nights endured. They reminded audiences that castles, despite their might, weren't impenetrable. Stone barriers repelled armies, but not winter. During long black hours, even the most powerful lord relied on blankets, fires, and companions, exactly like the poorest serf. So, as you consider medieval rest, hold both realities together. Stories of those who surrendered to frost and quiet victories of those who persevered. Every legend taught a lesson. Honour the night, defend against cold, and never assume survival was certain. Finally, you return to the hearth, the symbol that embraced every medieval sleeper in its radiance. Fire was never merely a tool, it was the home's heart, the line between existence and death. On winter evenings its light threw shadows across chambers, shadows that seemed to shift like protectors, dancing and moving as flames swelled and subsided. To sleep in a castle was to exist, in conversation, with fire. You feared it. You required it. You couldn't survive without it. The hearth's presence commanded every sense. Oak logs snapped like drumbeats in the room. Sparks jumped skyward, creating brief light trails before disappearing up the flue. Burning sap scent clung to wall hangings and hair. Heat pulsed in uneven bursts, scorching your face while your spine froze. The hearth was contradiction, both rescuer and tormentor, life source and smoky dictator. Nobility honoured fire as status symbol. Roaring hearths meant prosperity, the power to command servants gathering endless fuel, to clear forests if needed to maintain flames through darkness. Some households even hired special firekeepers, servants whose only job was ensuring embers never died. Allowing the hearth to grow cold was more than inconvenience, it was shame. Yet the poorest also assembled around their modest fires with equal respect. Peasants crouched on dirt floors, huddled with relatives and farm animals, watching flames lick rough logs. They laughed, shared tales, offered prayers, and passed bowls of broth. Theirs lacked the grandeur of carved stone hearths, but the warmth was equally genuine. In both fortress and cottage, fire drew people close and enabled sleep. A remarkable account from a German traveller describes villagers forming circles around hearths and extending hands toward flames before bed, murmuring blessings as if the fire itself held sacred power. They trusted the flames carried their wishes into night, guarding them during slumber. It shows how practical needs merged with ceremony. Fire wasn't only heat, but soul, remembrance, and belief. Historians continue wrestling with how much this reverence was practical versus symbolic. Some argue it was purely survival instinct, wrapped in tradition. Others suggest fire held genuine spiritual meaning, a force integrated into worldview and daily worship. Perhaps both perspectives are accurate. Medieval people lived close enough to danger that fire naturally transcended mere fuel. It became significance. Now place yourself in your imagined castle one final time. The bed drapes are closed, covers stacked high. Outside wind batters the towers, snow pelts the shutters, and night presses down with full force. Yet in the great hearth, coals still glow, their faint illumination seeping through curtain gaps. You shut your eyes, hearing flames' soft whisper, knowing they form the narrow barrier holding frost away. The sensory experience is total. Smoke's taste lingering on your tongue, wool and fur weight across your chest. A dog's warmth curled at your feet, prayer echoes resonating in your mind. You drift toward dreams, understanding that medieval sleep was never simple, never guaranteed, but always earned through every trick, ritual, and scrap of warmth available. Ultimately, castles were fortresses against humans, but never against winter. What preserved their occupants wasn't stone or steel, but endurance, creativity, and fellowship. Surviving the night meant layering covers, sharing heat, burning fuel, and holding on to hope. Against the endless chill of medieval darkness, humanity itself became the genuine fire. Now let the rhythm soften. Picture the embers glowing softly, their light no longer fierce but tender, like coals resting after long service. The chamber is still, wind rush beyond walls, fading to distant whisper. You feel blanket weight, heavy and sheltering, pressing you into the mattress. The battle with cold, the vigilance of fires, the noise of hounds and servants. All of it retreats, as though you've pulled a curtain across reality. Your breathing calms. Each breath tastes mildly of smoke and wool. Each exhale drifts into motionless air, the sounds that once rang out. Boots on stone, shutters clattering, monks chanting, now memories soften to murmurs. The castle itself appears to rest, its stones holding silence like a vow. Picture yourself secure within your cocoon. The dog at your feet exhales and adjusts. The final candle flickers out, and darkness wraps around you like another cover. The cold remains there, yes, but you no longer resist it. You accept it as those before you did, knowing that sleep is fragile peace with night. Your form grows heavier. Thoughts dissolve into patterns and hues. The medieval world, with all its chill and haze, becomes remote, like frost melting in sunlight. What lingers is only tranquility. You are warm enough, secure enough, weary enough. And so the narrative concludes. The hearth flickers, the bed cradles you, and the long night carries you gently into dreams. Rest now as they once did, wrapped in quiet strength. Sweet dreams.